Dr. Jonathan Reed stood in front of SCP-038, the everything tree, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like fingers reaching for something far beyond comprehension. The air around the tree felt thick, almost suffocating. Even the light from the overhead lamp seemed to dim as it touched the bark. He'd read the reports, seen the testing logs, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of this strange, silent anomaly. The tree appeared ordinary enough at first glance. Its bark was dark and rough, its roots tangled and creeping along the floor of the containment chamber like sleeping serpents. But the unease that gripped Jonathan's chest wasn't rooted in how it looked. It was in what it represented. Every object, every living thing that touched SCP-038 could be duplicated. An exact copy, a perfect facsimile, except not quite. The clones were never truly whole. His boots echoed softly as he stepped closer, clipboard in hand. He knew the protocol. Study the tree. Document any strange occurrences. Stay far enough away to avoid accidental contact. The last thing Site-23 needed was another unexplained incident, not after what had happened the week before. A chill crawled up his spine as he recalled the reports of a researcher who had inadvertently brushed his arm against the bark, only to find a doppelganger standing next to him minutes later. The clone had aged rapidly, withering into a husk within days. But it wasn't just the decay that had shaken the team. It was the way the clone had stared, as though it knew something the real man didn't. Something about him. Jonathan swallowed hard, trying to shake off the sensation. He was here to observe, to understand, and most importantly, to determine what had caused the recent string of anomalies. Reports of missing items, flickering lights, and strange whispers circulating through the facility had all been attributed to the presence of SCP-038. But none of it made sense. The tree didn't move, didn't act maliciously, at least not in any traditional sense. Yet Site-23 felt different, darker, as if the tree's influence stretched farther than they realized. He circled the perimeter of the tree, scanning it closely for any signs of unusual behavior. His fingers hovered over the clipboard, noting the way the bark seemed to pulse slightly, almost as if it were breathing. He had to remind himself that the tree was safe class, at least according to the Foundation's designation. But safe was a relative term. He knew well enough that even safe-class SCPs could hide dangerous secrets. A faint creak made him pause. The tree's branches swayed slightly, though there was no breeze in the sterile containment room. He furrowed his brow, narrowing his gaze at the tree, and suddenly the thought crept into his mind. Am I the real Jonathan Reed? The question hit him like a blow to the chest, and his heart skipped a beat. It was absurd. Of course he was the real Jonathan. He had a lifetime of memories to prove it. He could recall every detail of his journey to becoming an SCP researcher, every late night spent poring over documents, every choice that had brought him to this very moment. But that thought, the doubt, clung to him. The tree, standing so quietly in its containment, seemed to mock him. Had someone used SCP-038 to create a duplicate of him at some point? Would he even know? He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced at his reflection in the glass of the observation window. It looked like him. It felt like him. But that wasn't enough, was it? His mind raced through possibilities. If he had been duplicated, where was the real Jonathan? Dead, lost, or worse, still walking around somewhere in the facility. The idea was absurd, but the eerie silence of the chamber only amplified the paranoia creeping through his mind. It wasn't just a tree. There was something wrong with it, something far more sinister than any report could capture. Jonathan took a step back, his pulse quickening. He had studied countless SCPs, encountered anomalies that bent the very fabric of reality, but something about SCP-038 gnawed at his core. He couldn't shake the sensation that the tree was more than just an object that duplicated matter. It wanted something. His gaze drifted to the base of the tree, where something gleamed in the soft artificial light. He crouched down, careful to avoid any contact, and examined what appeared to be a discarded metal object, an ID badge. Frowning, he reached for it with gloved hands, turning it over. The name printed on it sent a jolt of ice down his spine. Dr. Jonathan Reed. The badge was his. He stood frozen, staring at the worn edges of the card, the familiar photograph of himself staring back, the faint smudges where he'd thumbed the plastic. His Idaho badge had never left his pocket, and yet here it was, lying beneath the everything tree as though it had been waiting for him. His breath caught in his throat. What if I'm the clone? The thought surfaced again, stronger this time, refusing to be dismissed. If the tree could duplicate him, what had it left behind? And how long had this version of him been walking through the halls of Site-23, unaware? Jonathan straightened, gripping the badge tightly. His mind raced, but he fought to keep his composure. Panic wouldn't help him now. He needed answers. But there was no one to ask, no one who could tell him if the real Jonathan Reed was still alive, or if this duplicate had taken his place without anyone knowing. He looked up at SCP-038 once more, its twisted branches looming over him like a silent sentinel. Was it aware of him? Did it understand what it had done? The chamber lights flickered, just for a moment, but long enough to send another surge of dread coursing through him. As the shadows shifted, Jonathan felt the weight of the tree's gaze, if it had a gaze, bearing down on him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the only sound he could hear was the frantic beating of his own heart. And somewhere deep within, buried beneath layers of fear and uncertainty, a small voice whispered, "Who are you, really?" The Idaho badge felt like dead weight in Jonathan's hand, a tether to a reality that was slipping further from his grasp. His mind churned, still reeling from the unsettling discovery. His badge lying beneath the tree, as though it had always been there. His chest tightened, the creeping fear clawing at the edges of his sanity. He stuffed the badge into his coat pocket, but the question lingered, was it even real? Was he? He shook his head and forced himself to focus. Now wasn't the time to unravel. There were still facts to cling to, and the best way to ground himself was through the cold, clinical truth of SCP-38. He turned his gaze back to the tree, the twisted bark resembling gnarled hands frozen in mid-reach. He pulled up the file on his tablet, scrolling through past test logs, trying to find clarity in the data. SCP-038, the everything tree. A seemingly innocuous anomaly that, in reality, held unimaginable power. It had been classified as safe, but every fiber of Jonathan's being screamed that it was anything but. The logs were filled with mundane examples of duplication, fruit, electronics, even furniture. Yet it was the biological duplications that turned his stomach. Cats, dogs, humans, every living thing that had made contact with the tree was copied, its clone emerging whole and almost perfect. But something was always off. The living duplicates aged rapidly, deteriorating within days, their bodies collapsing into something grotesque and unnatural. He scrolled past the familiar entries, stopping at one particular log that sent a chill down his spine. Test subject, SCP-500, Panacea pills. Result, duplicate exhibited partial effectiveness, with only 30% success in curing the ailments. Efficacy further deteriorated over time. Symptoms of permanent infection neutralized, but remained, suggesting incomplete replication of SCP's anomalous properties. So even something as simple as a pill had its powers warped when cloned. The consequences of duplicating more dangerous CCPs were unimaginable. Jonathan set the tablet down, his fingers rubbing his temples. The warnings had been clear, etched into the files. Do not duplicate living beings. Do not duplicate anything anomalous. Yet people, curious, reckless people, had broken protocol time and again. And now, it seemed, the tree was starting to take its own toll on reality, warping it in ways they hadn't anticipated. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the tree, noting the subtle shimmer in the air, almost like heat rising from asphalt, till the everything tree pulsed gently, an unnatural heartbeat beneath its bark. It was alive in ways no one fully understood. He remembered the test with the Class D personnel, how they'd been ordered to duplicate SCP-173, the statue, to see if its dangerous properties would carry over. He could still hear the recounting of the test in his head. The clone of SCP-173 grew at typical speed but halted abruptly when it reached the 200-pound limit. The result was grotesque, an incomplete form missing limbs but eerily alive. Even in its broken state, the clone still moved, albeit slowly, twisted and distorted. It lacked the same lethal immediacy as the original but retained a semblance of life, and in some ways that made it worse. Jonathan remembered the aftermath vividly. The clone didn't obey the same rules as its original counterpart. It moved regardless of observation, breaking one of the fundamental laws of SCP-173. A chilling thought crept through his mind. What happens when the rules no longer apply? The potential for catastrophic breaches was growing with every duplicate, every slip of protocol. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the images. Now, Dr. Lucius Harding had taken it further. Jonathan had no proof yet, but rumors had swirled for days. Lucius, driven by some warped sense of ambition, had allegedly begun experimenting on his own, duplicating SCP artifacts in Zero. The fear that these copies could spiral out of control gripped Jonathan's gut. A failed SCP duplicate might not just lose its effectiveness, it could mutate, grow unpredictable, and threaten to destabilize everything. Jonathan approached the tree, his heart pounding harder than he wanted to admit. He studied the roots curling through the floor, the slow, deliberate stretch of its branches. It was beautiful in a twisted way, a natural wonder that violated nature's most fundamental rules. He had seen its power, witnessed its ability to mirror the world in twisted, incomplete ways. But what scared him most wasn't its ability to clone objects. It was its insatiable hunger for more. The tree wanted to duplicate, to create, to spread. What it learned from the items it had touched. Could it feel the energy, the lives that passed through it? Jonathan shook the thought from his mind. It was nonsense. It was just a tree. But as he stared deeper into the rough bark, the thought gnawed at him. What if it isn't? He recalled the soulless clones, their hollow eyes and silent, unnerving stares. The moment they emerged, it was clear that something vital was missing. They were more than just incomplete versions of their originals. They were voids, empty shells that seemed to rot from within. The rapid aging and fermentation were merely symptoms of a deeper flaw in the replication process. The tree didn't just copy flesh, it took something far more essential. The soul, or, at least, a part of it. Jonathan's hands trembled as the implications sank in. If the tree could take pieces of a person's soul, what happened to those fragments? Were they lost forever, absorbed into the tree? Or was there something even darker at play? The quiet hum of the containment chamber only amplified the silence in his mind. He had to know, had to understand. He bent down, running his fingers just above the surface of the tree's roots, careful not to touch it. There was no doubt that SCP-38 had a personality of sorts. It seemed patient, watching, waiting for someone or something to make the next mistake. It wasn't malevolent in the traditional sense. It wasn't lashing out or attacking, but it was manipulating. It had no need to act aggressively. It just had to wait for curiosity, for human error, to do the work for it. The air in the room crevier, and Jonathan's thoughts twisted in knots. What was Lucius really trying to do? Could he be planning to duplicate something worse? Something that could tear apart the Foundation itself? Jonathan's mind buzzed with a gnawing sense of urgency. The tree stood before him, still and silent, but he could feel the pulse of its influence thrumming in the walls around him, seeping into his thoughts like a slow poison. He straightened up, turning to leave, but a single question hung in the air, heavier than before. What have we started? As he stepped out of the containment chamber, the light flickered once more behind him, the gentle hum of SCP-038 fading into the background. But even as he left, a faint, unnerving feeling followed him. Something was stirring just beneath the surface, and Jonathan knew that whatever was coming next would push them all far beyond what they were prepared for. And somewhere, deep in the core of SCP-038, the tree continued its quiet work, waiting for the next touch, waiting to grow. Jonathan stood at the edge of SCP-038's containment chamber, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as he watched the team of researchers move about. They were bustling, efficient, but too casual for his liking. He felt a knot forming in his chest as he observed them working around the tree, their hands dancing dangerously close to its bark. They were testing the duplication of small, harmless objects, candy bars, pocket calculators, random trinkets taken from the supply closets of Site-23. A tree loomed over them all, its twisted branches like skeletal arms, unnervingly still. Despite the benign nature of the tests, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, as if the tree was watching them, waiting. All right, let's move on to the next batch. One of the researchers, Dr. Bellamy, called out, holding up a chocolate bar in his gloved hand. He pressed it gently against the tree's bark, and within seconds, a second candy bar began to grow, slowly unfurling from the wood as though the tree had always been producing sweets. The process was almost mundane in its efficiency, a quiet horror masked by the innocuousness of the duplicated objects. Jonathan stepped closer, pretending to scrutinize the data on his tablet, but his eyes stayed on the growing candy bar, watching as it matured within moments. The air was unnaturally thick, as if the room itself were aware of the anomaly at play. His unease deepened as more duplicates formed, an old calculator, an empty coffee cup, a worn-out pen. Each item emerged from the tree's bark fully formed and flawless. But something about the simplicity of the task felt wrong. The process was too easy. Isn't it strange? Bellamy turned to Jonathan, snapping him out of his silent contemplation. It's like the tree's feeding on this stuff. I mean, look how fast it churns these things out. Jonathan nodded, but his attention remained fixed on the objects. Each one was a perfect replica, but were they truly identical? And he had seen what happened to the living things the tree copied, how they aged, withered, and eventually decayed. What if these objects were deteriorating too, just in a way no one had noticed yet? As the researchers moved to reset the equipment for another round of tests, one of them, Dr. Lawrence, moved too close to the tree. It happened in an instant, so quick that Jonathan barely registered it. Lawrence's arm brushed the bark as he bent down to grab his tablet, his skin grazing the tree's surface for the briefest of moments. Jonathan's heart lurched. He opened his mouth to warn him, but it was already too late. The air in the chamber seemed to shift, the hum of the overhead lights growing almost imperceptibly louder. There was a silence that followed, the kind that blankets a room just before disaster strikes. All eyes turned toward Lawrence as something began to grow from Specs 038's bark, something alive. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. It was a man emerging from the tree's trunk as though the bark were giving birth to him. The clone of Dr. Lawrence was grotesquely familiar. Every detail of his form identical to the original, his white lab coat, his graying hair, even the anxious expression he wore as he realized what had happened. But there was something wrong with the clone's face. The eyes. They were empty. A hollow gaze stared back at the real Lawrence, who stumbled back, nearly tripping over the discarded testing equipment. The clone blinked, slow and mechanical, its movements deliberate but lacking any trace of life, as though it were following some unseen script. For a moment the room was silent. No one dared move. The air had grown cold, the tension so thick it felt like it was pressing against Jonathan's skin. The clone stood still, facing its original, both men frozen in an uncanny mirror image. Dr. Bellamy broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Well, this isn't on the schedule," he muttered, but his voice wavered, betraying his fear. No one responded. Jonathan stared at the clone, his skin crawling with a deep, visceral unease. There was something about the way it stood, too rigid, too precise. The original Lawrence, still shaken, took a tentative step toward the duplicate, as if testing whether it would move on its own. The clone remained motionless, its eyes tracking the real Lawrence with unsettling calm. Suddenly, the clone moved. Its arm jerked upward, a stiff, unnatural motion that sent a ripple of panic through the group. Jon's hands instinctively tightened around his tablet, ready to shout orders, but the clone didn't attack. It simply mirrored Lawrence's movements, lifting its arm at the same angle, then dropping it back to its side. That's not me," Lawrence whispered, his voice barely audible. "No," Jonathan said quietly, his eyes locked on the clone. "It isn't." The clone's gaze shifted toward Jonathan, those empty eyes seeming to bore into him, cold and unfeeling. Jonathan could feel the weight of the tree's influence pressing down on him, a creeping sensation that crawled up his spine and coiled around his thoughts. The clone wasn't alive. Not really. It was a hollow shell, a puppet of flesh and bone. Whatever spark of life made Dr. Lawrence who he was had been stripped away in the duplication process, leaving behind something far more dangerous, a soulless imitation. And the lost bed. "It's just standing there," Bellamy muttered, breaking the silence again. "Why isn't it doing anything?" Jonathan knew the answer, though he wasn't sure he was ready to admit it. The clone was waiting, watching. It didn't need to act because it had already served its purpose. The tree had taken what it wanted, something deeper than flesh, something that couldn't be measured or quantified, a piece of the soul. "We need to get out of here," Jonathan said, his voice low but firm. "Now." The others hesitated, glancing between him and the clone as if waiting for further instructions. But Jonathan had seen enough. This wasn't just an accident. The tree had done something, taken something, and whatever it had left behind was a mockery of life. Lawrence looked pale, sweat beading on his brow. "Is it going to?" "I don't know," Jonathan cut him off, his eyes never leaving the clone. "But we're not waiting around to find out." As the team hurried to collect their equipment and leave the chamber, the clone of Dr. Lawrence remained perfectly still, its hollow eyes following them as they backed toward the door. Jonathan could feel its gaze lingering on him, even as they exited the containment room and the heavy door sealed shut behind them with a metallic hiss. He stood in the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest, a cold sweat clinging to his skin. The others were whispering, frantically discussing what had just happened, but Jonathan barely heard them. His thoughts were consumed by the sight of the clone's vacant stare, the way it had moved, deliberate, calculating, but devoid of any spark of humanity. And in the back of his mind, a new fear began to take root. What if it had been him? What if at some point he had brushed against the tree without realizing it? What if the man walking through these halls wasn't really Jonathan Reed at all? The memory of the ID badge beneath the tree surfaced once again. That small, innocuous reminder that he could have been duplicated at any moment, and he wouldn't even know. Behind the sealed door, the everything tree stood, silent and patient, its roots spreading deeper into the foundation of Site-23. And somewhere, in the dark recesses of its bark, a fragment of Dr. Lawrence's soul, like so many others before, was now trapped, feeding the tree's quiet hunger. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as he sat in his dimly lit office, reviewing test logs and containment protocols, the sensation gnawed at him, a constant, crawling presence just beneath his skin. He ran his fingers over the edge of his desk, trying to ground himself, but his mind kept drifting back to the clone, to its eyes. Hollow. Empty. Like it had been hollowed out from the inside. The others were treating the incident like an accident, a glitch in the duplication process, something they could file away and forget. But Jonathan knew better. There was more to SCP-038 than they had understood. It wasn't just copying the bodies of living things. It was taking something deeper. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He could still hear Dr. Lawrence's voice, shaky and pale, as they'd left the containment room. It didn't even react, Lawrence had said, like it didn't care. But that was what unnerved Jonathan the most. The clone didn't need to care. It was a shell, an empty vessel, devoid of whatever made Dr. Lawrence human. As the hours dragged on, he noticed strange things happening around Site-23. Subtle at first. Researchers moving through the halls with blank expressions, muttering to themselves. Their eyes glazed over as if they were sleepwalking. It was almost imperceptible, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But Jonathan was paying attention. In the cafeteria, he watched a clone of a janitor shuffle through his duties. His movements were slow, deliberate, lacking the fluidity of a living person. When another staff member bumped into him, the clone didn't react, didn't even blink. It simply continued sweeping, its eyes fixed on a distant point, unseeing. Jonathan leaned forward, his pulse quickening. It was happening again. These duplicates weren't just imitations, they were broken. They were missing something essential. They were hollow. He pushed his tray aside and stood up, crossing the room toward the janitor clone. "Hey," he said, his voice firm but cautious. The clone didn't respond, its hand still moving the broom across the floor in a slow, mechanical rhythm. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Hey," he repeated, louder this time. But the clone remained indifferent, its blank gaze locked forward. There was no recognition in its face, no spark of awareness. It was like looking into the eyes of a mannequin, a shell masquerading as human. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He reached out, his hand hovering near the clone's arm, and for a moment he hesitated. What was left of the person this had once been? He wasn't sure he wanted to know. The clone suddenly stopped sweeping, its head snapping toward Jonathan with a swift, unnatural motion. Jonathan stumbled back, his heart racing. The clone's eyes locked onto him, still emotionless, but now aware. A sharp electric tension filled the air, and Jonathan felt the cold sting of fear in his veins. Before he could react, the clone turned away, resuming its sweeping as though nothing had happened. But that brief moment, those empty eyes locking onto him, had confirmed his growing suspicion. The tree wasn't just duplicating bodies. It was stealing something from them, their souls. He rushed out of the cafeteria, his mind racing. If this was true, if SCP-038 was somehow harvesting fragments of people's souls, then every living thing that touched the tree was in danger. Every clone was incomplete, a dangerous reflection of the original, unpredictable, and potentially lethal. Jonathan made his way down the long corridors of Site-23, his thoughts swirling like a storm. He needed to find proof. He needed to understand what SCP-038 was really doing to its victims. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the sterile hallways, each step carrying him closer to the answers he feared. As he entered the research lab, he saw Dr. Bellamy standing over a series of monitors, reviewing the recent tests. Bellamy glanced up, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Bellamy said with a weak smile. Jonathan ignored the comment and approached the monitors, his eyes scanning the data. "I need the logs from the last week," he said, his voice urgent. Bellamy frowned. "Why? What's going on?" "There's something wrong with the clones," Jonathan muttered, flipping through the records. "They're not just physical copies. They're losing something when they're duplicated, something important." Bellamy scoffed. "You're being paranoid. The clones have always had side effects, rapid aging, a bit of mental sluggishness." "No," Jonathan snapped, cutting him off. "It's more than that. They're losing pieces of their souls." The word hung in the air like a bitter curse, and Bellamy's expression shifted from skepticism to unease. "Souls," he echoed, incredulous. "Come on, Jonathan, you don't believe that, do you?" Jonathan's hands trembled as he sifted through the logs. "I've seen it, the way they move, the way they act. It's like they're not really alive. They're just empty." Bellamy crossed his arms, his brow furrowing. "Look, I know SCP-038 is strange, but we have no evidence that it's doing anything beyond duplicating physical matter." Jonathan stopped, turning to face him. "Then how do you explain the way the clones behave? How do you explain the way Lawrence's clone just stood there, staring? It's like a part of him was missing." Bellamy hesitated, his mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came out. Jonathan could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the faint flicker of doubt creeping in. "I don't know," Bellamy finally admitted. Maybe there's something we haven't considered. But we need proof before we can make any conclusions." Jonathan nodded, his mind working furiously. He had to get closer to the truth. He had to confront SCP-038 again, test the limits of its abilities. If it really was harvesting souls, then there had to be a way to stop it. or at least contain it before more lives were destroyed. "I'm going back to the containment chamber," Jonathan said, his voice steely with resolve. Bellamy's eyes widened. "Are you insane? After what happened with Lawrence?" "I need answers," Jonathan interrupted, his voice cold. "And I'm going to get them." Without waiting for a response, Jonathan turned and left the lab, his footsteps heavy with determination. The air in the corridor felt colder, more oppressive, as if SCP-038's presence was leaking into every corner of the facility. When he reached the containment chamber, he paused, staring at the door. His reflection in the glass showed the fatigue etched into his face, the growing shadows under his eyes. He could barely recognize himself anymore. But it didn't matter. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. As he stepped inside, the sight of SCP-038 greeted him with an unsettling familiarity. Its twisted branches stretched toward the ceiling, unmoving, but somehow pulsing with a quiet malevolence. The air around the tree felt thicker, heavier, like it was breathing, waiting. Jonathan approached slowly, his heart thudding in his chest. He reached out, close but not touching, his fingers hovering just above the bark. "What are you?" The tree remained silent, as always, but Jonathan could feel it, the hunger beneath the surface, a dark, insidious pull that seemed to draw him in. And in that moment he understood. SCP-038 wasn't just duplicating objects or people. It was feeding on them, consuming the most vital part of their being, their souls. The clones weren't just flawed, they were dangerous. Soulless, unpredictable entities, hollow shells animated by something darker, something Jonathan couldn't yet fully grasp. He took a step back, his breath coming in short gasps. The implications of what SCP-038 was doing were staggering. And if he was right, then Site-23, and everyone in it, was in far greater danger than they realized. As he turned to leave the chamber, the tree's branches rustled softly behind him, as if acknowledging his discovery. And for the first time, Jonathan felt truly afraid, not of the tree itself, but of what it had taken from them all. The air in the hallways of Site-23 had become oppressive, thick, with an unseen tension that gnawed at Jonathan's nerves. Ever since he uncovered the truth about SCP-038 harvesting souls, he felt as though something dark was creeping through the facility, an invisible force shifting the air and bending reality at its edges. And at the heart of it all was Dr. Lucius Harding. Jonathan had always thought of Lucius as a brilliant researcher, if a bit reckless. But there had been whispers circulating, rumors about strange experiments, about Lucius stepping over boundaries no one else dared to cross. Recently, those rumors had turned to darker murmurs, suggestions that Lucius had been using SCP-038 to duplicate SCP artifacts. The very idea sent a shiver of dread down Jonathan's spine. Duplicating anomalies was beyond dangerous. It was madness. He made his way down the dimly lit corridor toward Lucius's private lab, his mind racing through the potential consequences. If Lucius had indeed duplicated SCP-5000, the miraculous healing pill, or SCP-173, the statue, the results could be catastrophic. Jonathan had seen firsthand how the duplicates from SCP-038 were flawed, twisted versions of the originals. What would happen when the anomalies themselves were warped? As Jonathan approached Lucius's lab, he paused, his hand hovering over the door's security panel. The lights above flickered briefly, just enough to make his heart skip a beat. The static hum of the overhead fluorescence seemed to resonate through the walls, as though the facility itself was on edge. He typed in his clearance code and the door slid open with a sharp hiss. The lab was dimly lit, cluttered with research notes, scattered equipment, and vials of unknown substances. And there, standing at the far end of the room, was Lucius Harding. His back was turned, his figure cast in shadow as he bent over a small containment unit. The sight of him, focused and deliberate, filled Jonathan with a sudden, sickening sense of foreboding. "Lucius," Jonathan called, his voice tense. Lucius didn't turn at first. For a moment, Jonathan wondered if he had heard him at all. Then, slowly, Lucius straightened, turning his head just enough to glance over his shoulder. His face was drawn, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Jonathan," he said calmly, "I wasn't expecting you." "I heard." Things. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes darting to the containment unit Lucius had been working on. "You've been duplicating SCPs, using SCP-38. Lucius turned fully, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You've always been perceptive, Jonathan." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "You know how dangerous that is." Dangerous. Lucius's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes, or revolutionary. Jonathan's stomach twisted. The air in the room felt wrong, distorted somehow, like reality was warping at the edges, struggling to hold itself together. "What did you do?" Jonathan's voice dropped to a whisper, his eyes scanning the lab for any sign of what Lucius had been working on. Lucius moved to the side, revealing the containment unit behind him. Inside, Jonathan could see several objects, some familiar, some foreign, but it was the sight of two pills, small and white, that made his blood run cold. "SCP-500, Jonathan muttered, his throat dry. Lucius nodded. "I've successfully duplicated it. Imagine, Jonathan, unlimited healing. A pill that could cure anything." "They don't work," Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising. "The duplicates never work like the originals. You know that. They're flawed." Lucius chuckled softly. "Flawed, yes. But even flawed miracles have their uses." His eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity. "I've tested the pills. Some of them work, partially. And others." His voice trailed off, his smile growing wider. "Others do things I never anticipated." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Lucius gestured toward another containment chamber at the far side of the lab. Jonathan hadn't noticed it at first, hidden behind a row of equipment. But as Lucius approached it, Jonathan's heart sank. Inside the containment chamber was something wrong. Twisted. A statue, barely half-formed, its surface cracked and malformed. It was the unmistakable form of SCP-173, but distorted, its head too large, its arms contorted in ways that made Jonathan's skin crawl. The clone was incomplete, but it moved, slowly. Its stone face was frozen in a grotesque, broken snarl, and even though Jonathan wasn't looking directly at it, he could feel its gaze on him. "You duplicated SCP-173, Jonathan's voice trembled with horror. "You've unleashed that thing." "It's not like the original," Lucius said calmly, staring at the clone with a detached fascination. "It's slower. It moves differently, but it still moves." And its presence. He trailed off, his eyes gleaming with something bordering on obsession. "It's affecting the environment around it. Warping it. Reality is bending." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He could already see the signs, the flickering lights, the way the air felt heavy, unnatural. The clone was distorting the world around it, as if it were tugging at the fabric of existence itself, stretching and twisting it into something unrecognizable. A flawed version of SCP-173 wasn't just a physical threat, it was unraveling reality. "This is madness," Lucius, Jonathan said, his voice tight with urgency. "You have to stop. The clones are dangerous. They're unstable." "Their power," Jonathan. Lucius snapped, his calm demeanor vanishing in an instant. "Power the Foundation doesn't understand. But I do. I see the potential." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. Lucius had gone too far. He had tampered with forces beyond control, and the consequences were spiraling out of reach. The duplicates are flawed. They can't be trusted. They're evolving," Lucius interrupted, his voice fervent. "They're becoming more than the originals, don't you see? SCP-038 is more than a tool for replication. It's creating something new, something greater. Jonathan shook his head, disbelief and fear warring within him. He couldn't let this continue. The clones were already warping reality, and if Lucius kept pushing, kept experimenting, the entire facility, no, the entire world could be at risk. "We need to destroy them," Jonathan said firmly, his gaze hardening. "All of the duplicates. They're a threat to everything." Lucius's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You're a fool, Jonathan. You're blinded by fear." Jonathan clenched his fists, his mind racing. There was no reasoning with Lucius anymore. He was too far gone, too obsessed with the power he believed SCP-038 offered. And now the facility was in grave danger. "I'm reporting this," Jonathan said, turning toward the door. "You've broken protocol. You've put us all at risk." But before he could take another step, Lucius moved, faster than Jonathan expected. He grabbed Jonathan's arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "You won't leave this room," Jonathan. Lucius hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't understand what's at stake." Jonathan yanked his arm free, his heart racing. "I understand perfectly. You've unleashed something we can't control." Lucius's eyes gleamed with a cold, manic light. "I control it. And soon the Foundation will see that." Jonathan's chest tightened with dread. There was no time to waste. He had to stop Lucius before it was too late, before the duplicates tore reality apart. Without another word, Jonathan bolted for the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. Behind him, Lucius's voice echoed through the lab, a chilling promise. "You can't stop evolution, Jonathan." As the door slid shut behind him, Jonathan's mind raced. He had to act quickly. Lucius's experiments had already warped the boundaries of reality, and if he continued, the results could be catastrophic. And somewhere, deep within the containment chamber, the twisted form of SCP-173's clone shifted, its broken limbs twitching as the very fabric of the world bent around it. The walls of Site-23 seemed to pulse, almost imperceptibly, like a living thing taking shallow breaths. Jonathan moved quickly through the corridors, but the familiar halls now felt stretched, elongated in ways that made him uneasy. Shadows played tricks on his eyes, darting and twisting in unnatural patterns as the overhead lights flickered erratically. And he could hear a faint hum, like distant machinery, but distorted, warped, just like everything else around him. Ever since Lucius had started duplicating SCP artifacts with SCP-038, reality itself seemed to be unraveling at the edges. Objects moved when they shouldn't, paper shuffled when no one was near them, pens rolled across desks with a deliberate slowness, as if something unseen was pushing them. The entire facility felt off kilter, as if the very laws of physics were bending under the weight of something unnatural. Jonathan's heart raced as he neared the containment wing. He hadn't slept in what felt like days, though time itself was becoming harder to grasp. His reflection in the glass walls seemed distorted, stretched like the architecture around him. The familiar sensation of unease gnawed at him, but this time it was sharper, more insistent. Every step felt like it was carrying him deeper into some otherworldly fracture, a place where reality no longer obeyed the rules. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle of a nearby door, and the cold metal sent a shiver up his arm. The door creaked open, and the room beyond was dimly lit, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of malfunctioning lights. Jonathan blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. But as he stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. The walls were breathing, slow, rhythmic movements, as if the concrete itself had become pliable, organic. He stared, wide-eyed, watching as the surface seemed to inhale, then exhale, its texture rippling like the skin of some massive creature. He pressed a hand to the wall, feeling its cold, solid surface beneath his palm, but the illusion, or was it an illusion, remained. His pulse quickened. The air was thick with a suffocating pressure, like he was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. It can't be real, he told himself, but the whisper of doubt lingered. Was reality truly shifting, or was he the one unraveling? His head swam with confusion, but before he could dwell on it further, a sharp, metallic clatter echoed down the hall behind him. Jonathan turned, his breath catching in his throat. The noise had come from the containment chambers, SCP-173's clone. He moved quickly, heart pounding, as he approached the containment room. The door was already ajar, and Jonathan hesitated. The clone inside was incomplete, malformed, and yet it had been moving. Reality had already begun to warp around it, and now, standing outside the door, Jonathan could feel a powerful tension in the air, a pressure that made his skin prickle. He pushed the door open slowly, his eyes scanning the room. The twisted form of SCP-173's clone stood in the corner, its broken limbs hanging at grotesque angles. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the room, and Jonathan could swear the clone had shifted, its head slightly tilted in his direction. The air felt heavier in here, charged with an almost electric static, and then, as if in response to his presence, the walls began to bend. Not just the faint, breathing movements from before. These walls stretched, elongating like liquid pulled by invisible hands. Objects in the room, the containment gear, the equipment, began to shift of their own accord, slowly sliding across the floor. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He backed away, trying to make sense of the surreal scene before him. He felt like he was trapped inside a dream, but the cold sweat clinging to his skin reminded him that this was all too real. He turned to leave the chamber, but as he stepped out into the hall, the air shifted again, a low whisper curling through his mind. "Jonathan." He froze, his blood turned ice. The voice had been soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that pressed down on him, like a memory trying to surface. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dim hallway. Nothing. The silence that followed was thick, unnerving, but just as he was about to take another step, the voice came again, closer this time. "Jonathan." His breath hitched in his throat. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. And when he blinked, he saw someone, standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was him. Jonathan stared wide-eyed as the figure stepped forward. It was an exact copy of himself, down to the smallest detail. Same dark eyes, same tired lines etched into his face. The same lab coat hanging from his shoulders, but there was something wrong about the way it moved. The doppelganger's steps were slow, deliberate, as if it were testing the limits of its own body. Who are you?" Jonathan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing slightly as it studied him. And then, with a cold, hollow voice, it answered, "I'm you, Jonathan, or at least, a version of you." Jonathan's heart thundered in his chest. His legs felt rooted to the floor as his mind raced. Or was this another clone? A product of SCP-038. But why did it look so real? Why did it feel so real? "You're lying," Jonathan said, his voice trembling. "You're not real." The copy smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent a wave of nausea through him. "Am I not?" it whispered. "Or are you the one who isn't real?" Jonathan's pulse spiked. His mind scrambled for answers, but none came. He backed away, but the clone stepped forward, mirroring his every movement. His head spun, memories crashing into each other like broken glass. Visions of himself, acting in ways he didn't remember, flashed through his mind. Moments of déjà vu that had seemed small, insignificant, now sharpened into something more sinister. Had he already been replaced? The copy's voice echoed through the hallway, each word dripping with icy certainty. "How do you know you're the real Jonathan, Hum? You think you've been watching, investigating, but how much of this has been you?" Jonathan swallowed hard, a pit of dread opening in his chest. "Stop. You're just another clone, a trick of the tree." The copy smiled again. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That you're the original? What if it's already happened, Jonathan? What if it's been happening all along?" The hallway around him seemed to blur, the walls bending and warping in unnatural shapes. The air felt thick, suffocating. Reality itself was cracking, and Jonathan was standing on the fault line. "I'm real," Jonathan whispered to himself, but the words felt hollow, like a prayer to a god that had long since stopped listening. The doppelganger took another step forward, its smile fading into something colder, more predatory. "Maybe," it said softly, "maybe not. But soon you'll have to choose, and when you do, you'll wonder. If you ever were." With those final, chilling words, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows like mist in the dawn. Jonathan stood alone, trembling, the weight of the reality shift pressing down on him. Was he being haunted by his own mind, or was the tree, manipulating him, pulling the strings behind the scenes? He couldn't tell anymore. The lines between what was real and what wasn't were blurring, and Jonathan was left to wonder if he had already crossed a threshold without even knowing it. Jonathan could hear the screaming long before he reached the containment area. It echoed down the sterile corridors of Site-23, a sound that seemed to scrape the very walls. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse a steady drumbeat of dread. He knew what was happening before he even saw it. The clones were revolting. The air around the facility had grown thick, oppressive, as if reality itself was suffocating under the weight of something monstrous. Jonathan had felt the shift, the gradual unraveling of order, since Lucius's duplications of SCP artifacts. But this was worse. The soulless duplicates were no longer passive, no longer content to merely exist in their hollow state. Now, something was driving them, something dark. He rounded the corner to the containment wing and froze. The hallway was chaos. Researchers and security personnel alike were scrambling, some lying unconscious or worse, others trying to contain the outbreak. And amidst the chaos, the clones, perfect imitations of the people they had once been, were attacking with a cold, emotionless violence. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. Their faces, they were expressionless, blank, like porcelain masks covering the emptiness inside. But their eyes, they were black holes, devoid of life, and yet filled with a hunger that chilled him to the bone. And one of the clones, a tall, hulking figure, threw a security officer against the wall with inhuman strength, the man crumpling to the floor like a rag doll. The clone's movements were jerky, mechanical, as though it wasn't fully in control of its own body. Yet it moved with brutal purpose. Jonathan swallowed hard and forced himself forward, heart hammering in his chest. He had to get to the source of this, SCP-38. The tree was at the center of all of this madness. The clones weren't just acting out on their own. They were being pulled toward the tree, like moths to a flame. He could feel it, the invisible thread connecting them all back to that cursed tree. As he moved, a cold whisper slid through his mind. A voice that had haunted him since the visions began returned to the tree. Jonathan shook his head, trying to clear the voice, but it clung to him, insidious, pulling at his thoughts like vines, wrapping around his mind. Ahead of him, he saw Dr. Bellamy, or what used to be Bellamy. His former colleague stood at the far end of the corridor, his once bright eyes now dark and vacant, his posture unnaturally rigid. Bellamy's clone stepped forward slowly, its eyes locking onto Jonathan with an eerie calm. It was as if it had been waiting for him, like it had anticipated this confrontation. Jonathan's stomach twisted into knots. He had worked with Bellamy for years. The man had been rational, sharp, a voice of reason in the madness of Site-23. But the thing standing before him now wasn't Bellamy. It was a husk. Without warning, the clone lunged forward, its speed unnatural, its movements more akin to a predator than a man. Jonathan barely had time to react, stumbling back as the clone swung at him with cold, unyielding force. He ducked just in time, the air hissing as the blow missed his head by inches. The clone's face remained eerily blank, as though it felt no emotion, no drive beyond the single, primal instinct to attack. Jonathan backed away, his mind erasing. There was no reasoning with it. Whatever had once been Bellamy was gone, replaced by this soulless thing. But as Jonathan readied himself for the next attack, something darker gnawed at him. The clones were moving with a purpose, a strange collective desire. They weren't just attacking randomly. They were all converging towards SCP-038. The clone came at him again, faster this time. Jonathan grabbed a fallen baton from one of the security officers, raising it just in time to block the clone's attack. The impact sent a shockwave up his arm, but he held firm, gritting his teeth as the clone pressed forward, its cold, dead eyes unblinking. Jonathan swung the baton, catching the clone in the side. The hit should have sent a normal man reeling, but the clone barely flinched. It simply turned its head, its blank gaze locking onto him once more. It was like fighting a machine, a puppet devoid of pain or fear. Jonathan's breath came in short gasps. He could feel the strain in his muscles, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, but the clone moved with an inhuman resilience. He swung again, this time aiming for its head, but the clone ducked with eerie precision, its movements robotic. They circled each other, the air between them thick with tension. Jonathan's heart raced as he looked into the clone's eyes that once belonged to a man he had known. Now they were voids, empty and dark, reflecting nothing but the cold grip of whatever force controlled them. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the clone lunged again. This time Jonathan was ready. He sidestepped, bringing the baton down hard on the back of its head. The clone stumbled, its movements faltering for the first time, but it didn't go down. It turned, slowly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, as though the blow had only disoriented it for a moment. Jonathan's stomach lurched. How could it still be standing? The clone charged again, faster and more vicious than before. Jonathan gripped the bit tighter, desperation clawing at him as he swung wildly, landing blow after blow. The clone staggered, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, relentless like a force of nature. Its strength seemed inhuman, fueled by something darker than Jonathan could comprehend. But Jonathan knew this fight wasn't about strength. It was about survival. With a final, desperate swing, Jonathan struck the clone in the neck, the crack of bone reverberating through the corridor. The clone's head snapped back, its body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. Jonathan stood there, panting, his arms trembling from the exertion. He stared down at the fallen clone, its life eyes still staring up at him, as though it could rise at any moment. He couldn't believe what he had just done. He had fought one of his own colleagues. No, a thing that looked like his colleague, and killed it. His stomach churned with a sickening mix of horror and guilt. But as he stood there, staring at the broken body of Bellamy's clone, the reality of the situation settled in. These things weren't human anymore. They were shells, driven by a singular purpose, to return to the tree. The sounds of fighting continued around him. Jonathan knew he didn't have much time. The clones were all moving towards SCP-38, drawn to it like moths to a flame. He had to get to the tree before it was too late. If the clones reached it, if they returned to their source, who knew what kind of catastrophe would unfold? As Jonathan turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby window. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, his eyes wild with fear. But something else lingered in his reflection, something wrong. For the briefest moments, the reflection smiled, a cold, empty smile, before flickering back to normal. Jonathan stumbled back, heart racing. Was it real? Or was the tree already playing with his mind? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. The closer he got to SCP-038, the more dangerous everything became. As reality itself was twisting, bending under the weight of something dark and ancient, and if he didn't stop it soon, there would be no turning back. With one final glance at the fallen clone, Jonathan turned and ran toward the heart of the facility, where SCP-038 awaited, its silent branches reaching ever outward, calling its hollow creations back to it. The revolt had begun, and Jonathan knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Jonathan's footsteps echoed down the long, sterile corridor as he made his way toward Lucius's private lab. His mind was a storm of confusion and anger, racing with the images of soulless clones, the bodies he had seen, and the violent chaos that had erupted across Site-23. There was no question anymore Lucius was at the heart of it. His reckless experiments, his obsession with duplicating SCPs, had pushed the Foundation to the brink of disaster. The door to Lucius's lab loomed ahead, half hidden in the shadowy hallway. Jonathan could already feel the pressure in the air, an unsettling tension that had become all too familiar. It was as though reality itself was bending around this place, shifting and warping under the strain of SCP-038's influence. his hand clenched into a fist at his side as he approached the door. Without hesitation, Jonathan punched his security code into the panel. The door slid open with a sharp hiss, revealing the dimly lit chaos inside. Lucius stood at the far end of the lab, hunched over a table cluttered with notes and equipment. The glow of containment chambers filled with SCP artifacts cast an eerie light across the room, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone. Lucius didn't look up as Jonathan entered, his fingers flying over a tablet deep in some twisted calculation. Jonathan's voice was low, but the anger in it was unmistakable. "Lucius." The scientist froze for a moment, then slowly straightened. When he turned to face Jonathan, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by that familiar cold arrogance. "Ah, Jonathan. I was wondering when you'd come." Jonathan stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the lab. He saw containment units housing duplicates, twisted, flawed versions of SCP-500, SCP-173, and other objects he didn't recognize. It was worse than he had feared. The air hummed with energy, reality itself vibrating as though something just beneath the surface was cracking. "You've been using SCP-038 to duplicate SCPs," Jonathan said, his voice tight with fury. "You've put us all in danger." Lucius didn't flinch. Instead, a cold smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Danger? No, Jonathan. What I've done is revolutionary. We now have the power to control anomalies like never before." Control Jonathan's voice rose, disbelief cutting through the anger. "Look around you, Lucius. The clones are out of control, attacking personnel. The entire facility is breaking down. Reality is." Shifting, Lucius interrupted, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "Reality is adapting. And yes, the clones have shown some instability. But that's all part of the process. This is evolution, Jonathan. We're on the verge of harnessing something far greater than any of us ever imagined." Jonathan stared at him, the weight of Lucius's words sinking in like a lead weight. "You're trying to build an army, aren't you? An army of SCP duplicates." Lucius's smile widened, his eyes shining with a fanatical light. "Imagine it, Jonathan. The Foundation wouldn't just be containing anomalies anymore. We'd control them. We'd have the power to reshape the world, to bend reality itself to our will." Jonathan shook his head, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You're playing with fire. These duplicates aren't just flawed, they're dangerous. They don't follow the same rules. SCP-173, the clones, they're warping reality. You've seen the signs. If you keep this up, you'll tear everything apart." Lucius's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "I have everything under control." "Do you?" Jonathan stepped closer, his voice hardening. "Because it doesn't look like it. The clones are drawn to SCP-038, as if something in them is trying to return to the source. And the distortions, reality is cracking around them. You think you're in control, but you're not. You're unraveling the very fabric of existence." Lucius's eyes narrowed. "You're overreacting, Jonathan." Jonathan's frustration boiled over. "Look around you, Lucius. What you've done, what you're still doing, it's going to destroy us all. You can't control this. You need to shut it down before it's too late." Lucius moved away from the table, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped in front of one of the containment units, where a duplicate of SCP-173, the twisted statue, stood frozen in its grotesque, malformed state. Its cracked, incomplete surface seemed to vibrate faintly, and Jonathan could feel the weight of its presence even from across the room. Lucius stared at the clone for a moment before speaking. "You don't understand the potential here, Jonathan. Yes, the clones are different. Yes, reality is shifting. But that's not a weakness, it's an opportunity. We're pushing the boundaries of what's possible. We're on the edge of something greater." Jonathan clenched his fists. And what happens when you push too far? What happens when reality breaks and you can't fix it? Lucius turned to him, his eyes cold and sharp. That won't happen. I've accounted for every possibility. The anomalies are contained. I'm in control. But as the words left his mouth, the lights overhead flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. A low, ominous rumble vibrated through the floor, and the very air seemed to shift, bend, as though something immense and invisible was pressing against the edges of reality. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The lab itself felt like it was warping, the walls subtly stretching, the containment units vibrating as though reality itself was straining to hold together. Lucius stepped back, his expression flickering with uncertainty. The rumbling grew louder, and for the first time Jonathan saw something in Lucius's eyes that hadn't been there before doubt. "I told you," Jonathan said, his voice trembling with the weight of the realization. "You're not in control. The cracks are already showing." Lucius opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the floor beneath them shifted, as though the ground itself had become unsteady. One of the containment units trembled violently, and with a sharp, deafening crack, the glass shattered. The clone of SCP-173 began to move, slowly, but unmistakably alive. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jonathan saw something that made his blood run cold. The air around the clone, around all of the SCP duplicates, was rippling like a distortion in space itself. The room felt unstable, as though it was caught between two realities, neither one fully real. Lucius stumbled back, his confident facade crumbling as he stared at the clone, now twitching and jerking with increasing speed. The cracks in its surface were growing, and Jonathan realized with dawning horror that it wasn't just the clone that was breaking, it was the fabric of reality around it. This isn't supposed to happen," Lucius muttered, his voice barely a whisper. His hands trembled as he backed away from the containment unit, his eyes wide with fear. Jonathan took a step forward, his voice low and firm. "This is what happens when you play God, Lucius. You've pushed reality too far." Lucius's breathing grew ragged as the walls around them seemed to warp and twist, the air filled with a strange electric tension. The clones, still frozen in their containment units, seemed to vibrate in unison, as though some unseen force was pulling them toward SCP-038. "We have to stop this," Jonathan said, his voice rising above the growing chaos. "We have to shut down the experiments now." But Lucius was frozen, his eyes locked on the clone of SCP-173, his mind unraveling along with the reality around him. The room shook violently, and with a deafening crack, the floor beneath them split. Reality itself was breaking apart, and Jonathan knew that if they didn't stop it soon, everyone would be lost. With one final glance at the fractured remains of Lucius's dangerous experiment, Jonathan turned and ran for the door. Behind him, the air shuddered as reality began to crack wide open. The corridors of Site-23 groaned under the weight of a reality unraveling. Every step Jonathan took felt like it was sinking into something thick and invisible, as though the air itself was dense with some malignant presence. He could hear the distant howls of chaos, the shrieks of those trapped in the grip of the soulless clones, but he knew it wasn't just the clones anymore. The tree was waking up. SCP-038, the Everything Tree, what they had thought was merely a strange anomaly, a tool capable of duplicating objects, was something far more dangerous, far darker. Jonathan could feel it in the pit of his stomach now. The tree wasn't just duplicating matter, it was feasting, growing stronger with each soulless husk it created. And the souls, the real essence of those it cloned, remained trapped within the tree itself, like prisoners bound in an unseen cage, fueling its hunger. The echoes of Lucius's failed experiments reverberated in his mind, but those were only the symptoms of the greater sickness. The tree had been patient, feeding slowly, subtly, but now it was no longer content with slow growth. Its hunger was ravenous, and the clones it had created were not merely failed duplications, they were vessels. Hollow, empty vessels awaiting something far worse. As Jonathan neared the containment chamber where SCP-038 stood, the walls seemed to ripple, the space warping like water disturbed by an invisible hand. Objects bent and twisted in impossible ways, papers floating upward in spirals, tables distorting as though they were melting. Time itself seemed to stretch and fold, moments blending into each other. He couldn't tell how long he had been walking. Minutes? Hours? The chamber door was slightly ajar, and beyond it he could feel the presence of the tree, pulsing almost like a heartbeat, slow, steady, and deeply unsettling. Jonathan stepped inside. The air was thick with a strange, suffocating pressure. The tree, SCP-038, stood in the center of the room, its dark, gnarled branches reaching upward like skeletal hands grasping for something beyond the ceiling. But it was no longer just a tree. The bark seemed to pulse, a rhythmic undulation, as if the tree itself were alive, breathing, feeding, and the space around it was not still. The ground beneath the tree's roots quivered, as though something monstrous writhed just below the surface. Jonathan's breath came in shallow gasps. He knew now what the others hadn't seen, what Lucius had refused to acknowledge. SCP-038 wasn't just a replicator. It was a predator. Each clone it created, each soulless copy, was a sacrifice, a fragment of life that it consumed, leaving behind only an empty shell. And the more it consumed, the stronger it grew. His eyes were drawn to the base of the tree, where the roots twisted into the floor like creeping tendrils. There was something shining there, something faint, and Jonathan stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, he realized what it was faces. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. The faces of the people whose souls had been trapped in the tree, researchers, security personnel, even Lucius's victims. They weren't dead. They were imprisoned, their souls bound to the tree, feeding its insatiable hunger. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber. Jonathan's eyes darted upward. One of the clones, a former researcher, her face blank and hollow, stood at the edge of the room, her limbs twitching with unnatural jerks. Her eyes, black and lifeless, locked onto Jonathan. The clone's lips parted, but no words came out, just a low, inhuman growl. And then, with a sudden burst of movement, she charged at him. Jonathan barely had time to react, his body moving on instinct as he grabbed a fallen metal rod from the floor. The clone's strength was terrifying, far beyond what a normal human should possess. She swung wildly, her fists crashing against the walls, the floor, each impact causing the air around them to warp. It was as though the very space they occupied was being twisted, stretched by the tree's influence. He blocked her next swing, the force of the blow reverberating up his arms. The clone's face remained emotionless, her eyes fixed on him with a blank, terrifying focus. Jonathan swung the rod, catching her across the side of the head. The clone staggered but didn't fall. It was like fighting a thing made of stone. As he fought her off, the other clones began to stir. Jonathan could see them now, emerging from the shadows of the chamber, their faces just as hollow, their movements mechanical, driven by something deeper than instinct. They were all drawn to the tree. He could feel it, a magnetic pull, guiding them toward its dark presence, as though they were mere extensions of its will. The clone lunged at him again, and this time Jonathan swung with all his strength, smashing the rod into her chest. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the room, and the clone collapsed to the ground, twitching once before falling still. Jonathan stood there, gasping for breath, his mind racing. He knew it wasn't over. The tree was still there, waiting, its hunger growing by the second. Each clone that fell, each soul that remained trapped within the bark, only seemed to fuel its growth. Suddenly, a deep, guttural rumble vibrated through the floor, as if something massive was stirring beneath the earth. Jonathan's heart raced as he realized the truth. The tree wasn't satisfied with mere fragments of souls anymore. It wanted more. The air around SCP-038 began to warp even more violently, the chamber groaning as reality itself strained under the weight of the tree's presence. The ground beneath the tree's roots seemed to crack, fissures spreading outward, as though the very foundation of the site was being torn apart. Jonathan staggered backward, his mind reeling. He could feel the tree's hunger, its malice, as though it were a living entity, a predator on the verge of breaking free from its cage. And then, as if in response to his thoughts, the tree's branches began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they twisted and writhed, reaching outward like tendrils of shadow, as though searching for something. The air around them vibrated with an unnatural hum, and Jonathan felt his chest tighten. The tree wasn't just feeding on the souls it had already claimed, it was searching for more. Its hunger was spreading, infecting the very space around it, warping reality in its wake. Jonathan's mind raced. He had to stop it. Somehow he had to cut off the tree's connection to the clones, to the souls trapped within. But how? The tree was more than just a physical entity now. It was something far older, far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. His eyes darted to the root of the tree, where the faces of the trapped souls flickered like phantoms. They were still alive, in some way bound to the tree's essence. If he could find a way to sever that connection, maybe, just maybe, he could stop the tree from growing stronger. But as the branches continued to writhe, and the clones began to stir once more, Jonathan realized he was running out of time. The tree's hunger was growing, and soon it wouldn't be satisfied with just the souls of the dead. It would come for the living. And Jonathan knew, deep down, that if he didn't act soon, he might be the next to feed the tree's insatiable appetite. The alarms blared, their shrill cries piercing the air like a death knell. Red warning lights bathed the facility in an eerie glow, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to pulse with the same unsettling energy Jonathan had felt ever since the tree began to stir. Something had gone horribly wrong. Jonathan sprinted down the corridors, his mind racing. He knew he had known that Lucius would push too far, but this was worse than anything he had imagined. The foundations of Site-23 were shaking, not just physically but metaphysically, as if reality itself was threatening to collapse under the weight of the SCPs being torn apart and recreated in twisted forms. SCP-038 had become more than a mere anomaly. It was a catalyst, pulling the boundaries of existence taut until they frayed. But it wasn't the tree alone that had caused the breach. It was Lucius, reckless and blinded by his ambition. Jonathan's warning had gone unheeded. The containment chambers were in chaos. As Jonathan approached, he could see shattered glass and broken steel scattered like debris from an explosion. But it wasn't just containment units that had been destroyed. The space itself seemed fractured, bent in ways that defied logic. The walls bulged unnaturally, the air shimmering with the impossible. He reached the observation deck overlooking the core containment units, just in time to see Lucius standing amidst the wreckage, his eyes wide with panic as he backed away from the broken containment of SCP-173's clone. The fractured statue, grotesque and malformed, stood motionless at the center of the room, its incomplete form a horrifying mockery of the original. "Lucius!" Jonathan shouted, but the words barely left his mouth before Lucius turned, his face pale, beads of sweat glistening on his brow. It's not supposed to be like this." Lucius stammered, his voice trembling with fear and disbelief. I was controlling it. I had everything under control." Jonathan's stomach twisted with rage and terror. "You never had control, Lucius. You've ripped reality apart." He gestured toward the clone of SCP-173, which now stood, its cracked and deformed body twitching slightly. The statue's head was only partially formed, its blank eyes unevenly spaced. But worse than its malformed appearance was the feeling it radiated. The room seemed to warp around it, the very air bending as if being drawn into the creature. Lucius stumbled back further, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I thought we could replicate its power, that we could use it. You thought you could play God, Jonathan shouted, his voice echoing off the twisted walls. And now look what you've done. As they stood there, the clone of SCP-173 shifted. Not physically, but perceptually. The space around it flickered like a broken film reel, its image distorting, phasing in and out of focus. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Jonathan's heart dropped. Where? The statue reappeared, not in front of him, but in the far corner of the room, its misshapen head turned toward the observation deck. A terrifying realization washed over Jonathan. It can move, even when we're watching. Lucius's eyes widened, his voice a whisper. That's impossible. The statue twitched again, and Jonathan saw the air around it shimmer, the fractured edges of its existence destabilizing the very laws of reality. Whatever SCP-038 had done to SCP-173, it hadn't just created a flawed copy. It had broken something fundamental. The clone no longer obeyed the rules of the original. Suddenly, the room began to vibrate, a deep, bone-rattling hum filling the air. The walls groaned, bending inward as if drawn toward the statue's unnatural presence. Jonathan staggered, his head spinning as reality itself warped around him. Lucius, we have to leave now. Jonathan yelled, but Lucius stood frozen, staring at the clone as if mesmerized by its power. And then the breach truly began. The statue disappeared again, but this time the entire room seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls folded inward, twisting into impossible angles as the space itself distorted, a black void swallowing the air. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that rattled Jonathan's teeth as he stumbled toward Lucius, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the exit. We need to go, Jonathan shouted, dragging Lucius toward the shattered door. Behind them, the room continued to collapse, reality breaking down piece by piece, fragmenting into nothingness. But just as they reached the door, the clone of SCP-173 reappeared, this time right in front of them. Jonathan froze, his breath caught in his throat. The statue's half-formed face loomed inches from his own, its cracked mouth twisted into a grotesque sneer. But its eyes were what terrified him the most. Even though they were incomplete, uneven, there was something alive in them, something that pulsed with the same dark hunger he had felt in the tree. The statue moved, not in the jerky, mechanical way it was known for, but in a slow, deliberate motion, its hand reaching out toward him. Jonathan's mind screamed in terror, every instinct telling him to look away, to run. But he couldn't. His eyes were locked on the statue, and the space around him felt like it was closing in. Lucius whimpered beside him, his body trembling uncontrollably. "We're going to die." "No," Jonathan whispered, forcing himself to move. He grabbed Lucius again, pulling him away from the statue, just as the room began to collapse further. They stumbled into the hallway, the sound of the breach roaring behind them, a cacophony of tearing reality. As they fled, the walls of the facility continued to warp, the twisting of reality expanding outward like a spreading infection. Lights flickered violently, floors buckled, and objects, desks, chairs, equipment, began to slide across the floors as though pulled by an unseen force. The breach wasn't just contained to one room anymore. It was spreading, tearing through Site-23 like a storm. And at its heart was SCP-173's clone, a being no longer bound by the rules of the original, now free to warp space and time as it pleased. "Lucius, how do we stop this?" Jonathan gasped as they ran, his legs burning with exhaustion. Lucius shook his head, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I don't know. This wasn't supposed to happen. I thought I could control it." Jonathan gritted his teeth. "There has to be a way, something we can do to shut this down." Lucius stumbled, nearly collapsing to the floor. "The tree, SCP-038, maybe if we destroyed the clones, maybe the tree will stop." Will stop. stop. Jonathan's mind raced. The tree had been feeding off the souls of its duplicates, growing stronger with each new clone. But now, its influence had spread beyond the clones. It had infected reality itself. Could destroying the clones really sever the tree's connection to the breach? Another violent tremor rocked the facility, and Jonathan knew they didn't have time to debate. They had to act, now. He turned to Lucius, his face grim. "We're going into the tree." Without waiting for a response, Jonathan dragged Lucius to his feet and began running towards SCP-38's containment chamber. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. If they didn't stop the tree, Site-23, and everything within it would be consumed by the breach. And the tree's hunger would never be satisfied. The facility was crumbling. Jonathan could feel the weight of its collapse pressing down on him with every step, as though the air itself had thickened, becoming hostile. SCP-173's clone was on the loose, warping space with its fractured existence. And now, other SCP duplicates had begun to tear through Site-23, their corrupted forms wreaking havoc on the already fragile reality. Jonathan knew what he had to do. Lucius had to be stopped. The corridors of the facility stretched unnaturally before him, twisting and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Walls that had once been solid now rippled, as if made of liquid, and the floor buckled beneath his feet with every tremor that rocked the structure. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that unnerved him. It was the way reality itself seemed to be disintegrating. Time bent, seconds stretching into minutes, and objects shifted positions when he wasn't looking, as if the facility was no longer bound by the same rules of existence. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed forward. Lucius was somewhere deep within the containment wing, still clinging to his delusion of control. Jonathan had seen it in Lucius's eyes during their last encounter. The madness, the obsessive hunger to bend the anomalies to his will. But now, Lucius wasn't just gambling with anomalies. He was gambling with reality itself. As Jonathan rounded a corner, his heart lurched at the sight before him. The containment chamber for SCP-500, the miracle cure-all pills, had been shattered, and something was crawling from the wreckage. At first glance, it looked like one of the pills had been duplicated by SCP-038, but as Jonathan moved closer, the shape twisted and expanded, growing grotesquely into a bloated, malformed creature. The clone was incomplete, its surface undulating like liquid flesh, its grotesque limbs flailing as it dragged itself across the floor. Where SCP-500 had once been a beacon of hope, its clone had become something nightmarish, a parasite, feeding off the instability of the breach. Jonathan's stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. He couldn't afford to engage with these broken anomalies. He had to find Lucius. The deeper he ventured into the facility, the worse the corruption became. Doors led to nowhere, opening into voids of utter blackness, while others led him in looping circles, depositing him back into the same hallways he had just escaped. The only constant was the oppressive hum of SCP-038, its presence growing more potent with every step, as though the tree was feeding off the chaos it had created. He encountered more corrupted clones, twisted versions of SCPs whose original forms he recognized. There was a malformed, twitching version of SCP-914, the Clockworks. But instead of refining objects, the clone seemed to break them apart, reducing everything it touched into jagged, splintered pieces. Further along, Jonathan glimpsed a clone of SCP-131, one of the iPods, its usually harmless form now distorted and hostile. Its eye darkened and leaking a thick, viscous fluid as it stumbled aimlessly through the halls. Every encounter only confirmed what Jonathan feared most. SCP-038 wasn't just duplicating. It was corrupting, feeding off the anomalies it cloned, and twisting them into grotesque versions of their former selves. But it wasn't just the clones that worried him. It was the tree itself. SCP-038's influence wasn't limited to the clones. It had seeped into the very foundation of the facility, warping space and time, unraveling reality at its core. Jonathan could feel the tree's hunger growing, its dark tendrils spreading through the structure like roots, pulling everything toward it. It was connected to all of the chaos feeding on it, growing stronger with each passing moment. And then he saw it, Lucius. He stood at the far end of the containment wing, his back to Jonathan, his figure outlined by the flickering lights above. He was hunched over a console, his hands moving frantically across the controls as he muttered to himself. The scene was surreal. Lucius, once so composed, now a man on the brink of collapse, his movements erratic, his mind clearly unraveling. Lucius. Jonathan's voice echoed down the corridor, sharp and furious. Lucius froze, his shoulders tensing. Slowly he turned, and Jonathan saw the wild gleam in his eyes. The man who had once been so calculated, so sure of his ability to control the anomalies, now looked like a man teetering on the edge of insanity. "Get onward. You shouldn't have come," Jonathan, Lucius rasped, his voice low and hoarse. "I'm hoarse. So close to mastering it. Mastering it." Jonathan spat, advancing on him. "Look around you, Lucius. You've lost control. The clones are destroying everything. The breaches are spreading. Reality is collapsing." Lucius's eyes flickered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I just need more time. The tree is killing us." Jonathan cut him off, fury boiling in his chest. "It's feeding off everything. It's feeding off you, Lucius. Can't you see that?" Lucius's smile faltered. For a moment, something like doubt crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by that same wild, fanatical gleam. No, you don't understand. The tree, it can give us power, real power, Jonathan. We can control everything, bend it to our will. I just need to perfect the process." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. "There's no process, Lucius. The clones are unstable, and the tree is using them to tear apart the world." But Lucius wasn't listening. He turned back to the console, his hands moving over the controls, muttering to himself. "I'm so close. Just a little more time. I can make it right." Jonathan's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the very fabric of reality warping as the breaches spread. He had no time to reason with Lucius. If the tree wasn't stopped, Site-23, everyone in it, would be consumed. The air around them shuddered, and Jonah's eyes flicked to the walls. They were stretching, the cracks in reality widening as SCP-038's influence grew. It was as if the facility itself was being drawn toward the tree, pulled into its maw, where everything was consumed and twisted into something monstrous. Jonathan took a step toward Lucius, his voice cold and firm. "I won't let you do this." Lucius barely looked at him, his voice a frenzied whisper. "It's too late, Jonathan. The tree is part of everything now. Can't you feel it? It's connected to all of it, to us." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He knew Lucius was right, in a way. SCP-038 had become more than just a physical anomaly. Its roots, its presence were interwoven with the clones, with the anomalies it had corrupted. But now its reach extended beyond that. It was connected to them, to every living being in Site-23, feeding on them. A violent tremor rocked the facility, the walls groaning as the cracks deepened. The ground beneath them quivered, and Jonathan could feel the air thickening with the weight of the breach. He had no choice. Jonathan lunged forward, grabbing Lucius by the arm and yanking him away from the console. Lucius struggled, his movements frantic, but Jonathan's grip was iron. "We have to stop this," Jonathan shouted, dragging Lucius toward the door. But Lucius only laughed, a mad, broken sound. "There's no stopping it. The tree. It's part of everything now. You'll see." As they stumbled into the hallway, Jonathan knew the truth. SCP-038's hunger had grown too vast, too insatiable. It had consumed not just the anomalies, but Lucius's mind, warping his vision of control into delusion. Now, it threatened to consume them all. The hunt for Lucius was over, but the fight to stop the tree had just begun. Jonathan stood before SCP-038, his heart pounding as the tree's dark, twisted branches loomed above him, stretching toward the ceiling like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The air around it felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the tree was pulling the very breath from his lungs. He knew what he had to do now: enter the heart of the tree. The knowledge weighed heavily on him. SCP-038 wasn't just a machine for duplication. It was alive, a malevolent entity feeding on the fragments of the souls it had captured. The soulless clones it created were merely shells, empty husks bound to the tree's will, while the true essence of those beings remained trapped within its gnarled roots, fueling its ever-growing hunger. The breaches, the warping of reality, all of it stemmed from the souls locked within the tree, twisting and distorting the world around them. Jonathan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. If he was going to stop the clones, if he was going to prevent the destruction of Site-23, and perhaps something far worse, he would have to go inside. He would have to destroy whatever lay at the core of SCP-038, sever its connection to the souls trapped within. But what lurked inside? He didn't know, but the truth was horrifying enough. He could feel the pull of the tree, its presence wrapping around him like a slow, creeping poison. It was calling to him. It knew he was coming. The chamber around him was in chaos. The warping of reality had worsened, with the walls and ceiling rippling as though they were no longer solid. Shadows twisted and shifted, their shapes stretching unnaturally, and the floor beneath his feet felt like it was on the verge of buckling. Every now and then objects, equipment, debris would flicker out of existence, only to reappear moments later, as though they had been momentarily swallowed by the tree's growing power. Jonathan reached down, his hand brushing against the cold metal of a crowbar. He had found it earlier in the wreckage, left behind by a fleeing member of the security team. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The tree's bark pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It was as though the tree itself was alive, watching him, waiting. He had no idea what lay beyond that twisted exterior, no idea what would happen once he stepped inside, but he couldn't turn back. Not now. Jonathan took a deep breath and approached SCP-038. His fingers hovered just above the bark, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath with him. The whispers that had plagued him since the start of this nightmare grew louder in his mind, insistent, pulling at the edges of his thoughts. Come closer. His skin prickled, every instinct screaming at him to stop, to turn back. But he couldn't. This was the only way. He pressed his hand against the bark. The world around him shifted. The air grew cold, unnaturally so, and his vision blurred as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He felt the bark beneath his hand soften, almost like flesh, and then, without warning, he was pulled inside. The chamber around him disappeared, swallowed by an all-encompassing darkness. Jonathan gasped, stumbling forward as the floor beneath him twisted into something slick and soft. His heart hammered in his chest as his eyes adjusted to the sudden blackness. He was no longer in the containment room, he was inside the tree. The space was a vast, hollow cavern, stretching impossibly far in every direction, as though he had stepped into another dimension entirely. The walls of the tree pulsed faintly, glowing with a sickly green light that cast eerie shadows across the space. The sound of something breathing echoed all around him, a slow, rhythmic inhalation, as though the tree itself was alive. Jonathan steadied himself, his hand gripping the crowbar even tighter. The air in here felt wrong, thick with a palpable malevolence. He could feel the tree's hunger, its desire to consume him. But there was something else too, something deeper. From the trapped souls. He could feel their presence, like a faint whisper at the back of his mind, calling out to him, begging for release. He took a step forward, the ground beneath him squelching like wet earth. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bending and warping as it traveled through the cavern. As he walked, the pulsing light grew stronger, illuminating more of the space around him. The walls of the tree seemed to pulse and shift, the texture of the bark writhing like something alive. And then he saw them. Faces. Hundreds of them, embedded in the walls of the tree, their features twisted in agony. Their eyes, hollow and unseeing, stared out at him, their mouths frozen in silent screams. These were the souls the tree had consumed, the fragments it had trapped within itself. They weren't dead. They were still alive, their essence bound to the tree's will. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The weight of their suffering pressed down on him like a physical force. He could feel their despair, their helplessness, as though it was a part of him. The tree had taken their souls, stripped them of their identity, and left only these hollow shells behind. But the worst part, the part that made Jonathan's blood run cold, was that he could recognize some of them. Faces of colleagues, security personnel, even Lucius's victims. Their souls had been trapped here, bound to the tree, feeding its insatiable hunger. Is this what it wants from me? Jonathan thought. Was the tree trying to trap him too, to feed off his soul and leave him just another hollow face in the wall? He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to move forward. He could feel the pull of the tree growing stronger as he neared the center of the cavern, where the light was brightest. This was where the core of the tree's power resided. This was where he would find the heart of SCP-038. The air grew colder the deeper he ventured, and the breathing sound grew louder, more labored. He could feel the tree watching him, its hunger palpable. But he pushed through the fear, knowing that this was the only way to stop it. At last, he reached the center of the cavern. Before him stood a massive, pulsing mass of roots and tendrils, writhing like a nest of serpents. This was the heart of the tree, the source of its power. The tendrils seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and coiling around one another in a grotesque dance. And at the very center, Jonathan saw them, the soul fragments. They floated within the mass of roots, shimmering like faint orbs of light, each one representing a life the tree had consumed. They pulsed faintly, their light flickering with the rhythm of the tree's heartbeat. If he could destroy them, sever the tree's connection to the souls it had trapped, he could stop this madness. He could end the warping of reality and free those it had consumed. But the tree wasn't going to let him do that easily. As Jonathan raised the crowbar, ready to strike at the heart of the tree, the tendrils lashed out. One of them wrapped around his wrist, pulling him toward the pulsing mass with terrifying strength. He struggled, gasping as the air around him seemed to thin. The tree's will pressed down on him, suffocating him with its desire to consume him. But Jonathan was determined. With a surge of adrenaline, he tore his wrist free and swung the crowbar with all his might, bringing it down on the mass of roots. The impact sent a shockwave through the cavern, and for a moment the light dimmed. The tree shuddered, its tendrils thrashing wildly. Jonathan struck again, harder this time, and the roots began to crack, their grip loosening on the trapped souls. He could feel the tree screaming in his mind, its voice a deafening roar of fury and hunger. But Jonathan didn't stop. He swung again and again, each blow cracking the heart of the tree further, weakening its hold on the souls. And then, with one final strike, the heart of the tree shattered. The light from the soul fragments burst outward, flooding the cavern with a blinding brilliance. The tendrils of the tree writhed violently before falling still, and the cavern shook as the tree's hold on reality finally began to break. Jonathan fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the souls were released from the tree's grip, their light fading as they were freed from their prison. But even as the light dimmed, Jonathan could feel it, the tree's presence, still lingering, still watching. It wasn't dead. Not yet. But for the first time, its hunger had been denied. The cavern around Jonathan flickered, as though the very fabric of reality was fraying at the edges. The brilliant light from the shattered heart of SCP-038 still lingered in his eyes, and though the tree's grip on reality had loosened, it hadn't released him completely. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, and his breath felt thick, heavy with something unspeakable. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that unnerved him. It was the growing sense of disconnection from himself, from time, from everything. As he moved deeper into the heart of the tree, a creeping suspicion grew within him, a gnawing thought that twisted in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't alone. He felt a presence. No, not just one, many. And they were all him. A movement in the corner of his eye stopped him cold. Jonathan whipped around, the crowbar in his hand raised defensively. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint green light pulsing from the walls of the tree. His heart skipped a beat as he stared into his own eyes. It was him. The man standing before him was Jonathan Reed, down to the smallest detail. His lab coat was torn and bloodied in exactly the same places, his face weary, shadowed by the same exhaustion that Jonathan felt. But there was something different. A coldness in the eyes, a calculation that wasn't quite human. "Who are you?" Jonathan demanded, though the answer was already suffocatingly clear. The duplicate smiled, a hollow, twisted expression that sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine. "I'm you," it said, the voice calm, emotionless. Or at least, I was. Jonathan took a step back, his pulse quickening. "No, you're not me." The duplicate tilted its head, as if considering this. "Maybe not," it replied softly, stepping closer. "Maybe I'm better. Maybe I'm the version of you that was supposed to be." Before Jonathan could react, another figure moved in the shadows behind him. His breath caught in his throat, and he turned just in time to see another Jonathan stepping out of the darkness, this one slightly disheveled, his eyes wide with fear. His hands were trembling, and when he spoke, his voice was panicked, desperate. "Jonathan, you have to run. The tree, it's using us. You can't trust them. They're—" The first duplicate's smile widened, and in a flash of movement it lunged toward the frightened clone, slamming him against the wall. The cavern seemed to pulse with the force of the impact, the walls trembling as reality bent and warped around them. Jonathan stared in horror as the two versions of himself struggled. The calculating, cold-eyed version had pinned the terrified one, its fingers tightening around his throat. "Stop," Jonathan shouted, rushing forward. But the moment he tried to intervene, another figure stepped into his path. A third Jonathan. This one looked serene, calm, as though none of this madness could touch him. He held up a hand, stopping Jonathan in his tracks. "Don't," the third duplicate said, his voice gentle. "You can't save them. They're part of you, just as I am." Jonathan's mind spun, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around him. He backed away, his heart racing, as the first clone continued to choke the life out of the second. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he turned to face the third clone, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" Jonathan demanded, his voice trembling with fury and confusion. "What does the tree want from me?" The calm version of himself smiled softly, his eyes distant, as though he had already transcended the madness. "The tree has shown you what you are, Jonathan. These versions of you, each of them is a piece of the whole. Some are stronger, some weaker, some are broken. But in the end, only one of us is real." Jonathan felt a cold dread wash over him. "And which one is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The serene clone shrugged, the gesture almost casual. "That's for you to decide." Jonathan's mind reeled. The tree had created multiple versions of him, each one slightly different, each one reflecting some fragment of his identity. But the more he saw, the more disoriented he became. How could he know which one was the real Jonathan? What if he was just another clone, another hollow reflection, twisted by SCP-038's power? The cavern seemed to shift, reality flickering as the duplicates moved around him, watching, waiting. The first clone had finished strangling the panicked one, and now stood motionless, its cold eyes locked on Jonathan, as though it was waiting for something. The third, calm duplicate still stood in front of him, his expression placid, almost serene. Jonathan's thoughts spiraled into confusion. Every step forward felt like sinking deeper into an endless pool of doubt. What if none of them were real? What if the real Jonathan had been consumed by the tree long ago, and all that remained were these fractured pieces, vying for dominance? Come closer. The whisper slid through his mind again, pulling him toward the pulsing core of the tree. The faces of the trapped souls still writhed in the bark, their eyes watching him with silent, pleading desperation. And somewhere, deep within the heart of the tree, he felt something stir, something that knew him. Jonathan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. It didn't matter which of these clones was real. It didn't matter if he was the original or just another soulless fragment created by the tree. What mattered was that the tree's grip on reality had to be severed. He turned to the cold-eyed duplicate, the one that had just killed the panicked version of himself. "You want to prove you're the better version of me," Jonathan said, his voice cold and firm. "Then help me stop this." The clone's lips curled into a twisted smile. "Gladly." Together they turned toward the pulsing heart of the tree, the other duplicates watching in silence as Jonathan approached the center once more. The air grew colder, the pulsing light flickering in rhythmic beats, as though the tree itself was waiting for them. Jonathan knew the truth now. The tree had taken something from all of them, something vital. And now, it was offering him a choice. But there was only one way to end this. "Destroy the heart," Jonathan whispered to himself, raising the crowbar. The cold-eyed duplicate stepped aside him, ready to strike. The tree's pulsing grew louder, more frantic, as though it sensed its end was near. Jonathan swung the crowbar with all his strength, and the first blow sent a shockwave through the cavern. The walls trembled, the ground shaking beneath him, and the faces embedded in the bark screamed in silent agony. He struck again. The tendrils writhed, the light flickering wildly as the tree's heart began to fracture. Reality itself shuddered, the walls bending and warping, as though the tree was fighting back. But Jonathan didn't stop. The heart of the tree cracked open with a deafening shatter, and in that instant, the world around him seemed to collapse inward. The duplicates disappeared, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke, and Jonathan was left standing alone in the pulsing, flickering darkness. And then silence. For the first time, the tree was still. The silence that followed the shattering of SCP-038's heart was deafening. Jonathan stood amidst the fractured roots and tendrils, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of what he had just done pressing down on him like an invisible force. The tree, for the first time since he'd encountered it, was still. The pulsing, the thrumming hunger, all of it had ceased. But the sense of finality that Jonathan expected never came. Instead, the air around him felt heavier, thick with an unsettling tension, as though something vast and terrible still lingered just beyond his reach. He knew instinctively that this wasn't over. The tree might have been wounded, but its true power, its essence, was deeper within. And he turned, his eyes drawn to a faint, flickering light at the far end of the cavern. It was a soft, pale glow, pulsing slowly like a dying heartbeat. The walls around him seemed to shift, warping subtly as though reality itself was loosening. And Jonathan knew that this light, this chamber, was the true core of SCP-038. With the crowbar still clutched tightly in his hand, he made his way toward the light. The ground beneath him felt strange, almost spongy, as if the tree's roots were still alive, even though their connection to the physical world had been severed. The closer he got, the stronger the pressure in the air became, pushing against him like a living thing. At last he stepped into the soul harvest chamber. The room was vast, impossibly so, stretching far beyond the confines of the tree's physical form. The walls were lined with dark, twisting roots, and embedded within those roots were glowing fragments of light. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. They pulsed softly, their light faint but undeniable, like the dimming flames of trapped souls. Jonathan's heart lurched as he realized what he was looking at. The souls of everyone the tree had ever duplicated. Every person, every living thing that had touched SCP-038. Their essence had been torn from their bodies and trapped here, feeding the tree's dark hunger. The fragments floated within the roots, like tiny embers, their light flickering as though they were struggling to stay alive. Jonathan stepped forward, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief. He recognized some of the faces in the flickering light, his colleagues, the researchers and security personnel who had vanished over the years. And then, as he moved deeper into the chamber, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His own face. It was embedded within one of the roots, flickering faintly, its eyes closed as though in deep sleep. The fragment glowed softly, but there was no denying it. It was him, or at least it was some part of him. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. His hand reached out instinctively, trembling as it hovered just above the glowing fragment. He could feel it, the connection. It was faint, but it was there, like a distant echo of something he had forgotten. And in that moment, the terrible truth hit him with the force of a tidal wave. His soul, his essence, was trapped here, just like all the others. He wasn't whole. He was just another duplicate, another fragment torn from the original and left to wander the halls of Site-23, believing he was the real Jonathan Reed. The weight of the realization nearly brought him to his knees. His mind reeled, spinning with the implications. He had suspected it for a while now, but seeing it, feeling it, was something else entirely. His memories, his thoughts, his actions, they were all just pieces of the whole. Fragments of a soul that had been torn apart and scattered by SCP-038. Am I the original? The question echoed in his mind, but there was no answer. How could there be? The original Jonathan, if he even existed, could be long gone, his soul consumed or lost to the tree's hunger. Or worse, Jonathan himself could be just one of countless duplicates, each one believing it was real. His hand fell to his side, the crowbar slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor with a dull thud. He stood there, staring at the glowing fragment of his own soul, his mind a swirling storm of confusion, anger, and fear. But as the silence stretched on, something stirred within him, a flicker of resolve. He might not know whether he was the original or just another duplicate, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was ending this, destroying the tree's grip on the souls it had taken, and freeing them from this prison. Jonathan took a deep breath, his chest tight with determination. He wasn't going to let the tree win. Not now, not after everything. His gaze swept across the chamber, taking in the countless glowing fragments embedded in the roots. Each one represented a life, a soul that had been torn apart by SCP-038, and each one deserved to be set free. He reached for the crowbar again, his fingers tightening around the cold metal. This time there was no hesitation. With a sharp swing, he brought the crowbar down on one of the glowing fragments. The moment it connected, a shockwave rippled through the chamber, and the light from the fragment exploded outward in a burst of brilliance. Jonathan stumbled back, his heart racing as the roots trembled, the walls of the chamber shaking violently. But he didn't stop. One by one, he struck the fragments, each blow sending shockwaves through the chamber. The light from the shattered souls filled the room, growing brighter and more chaotic with every swing. The tree groaned, its tendrils writhing as if in pain, and the pulsing light from the remaining souls flickered desperately. Jonathan could feel it. The tree's hold on reality was breaking. Its connection to the souls it had trapped was unraveling, its power weakening with every fragment he destroyed. But as he swung again, something shifted. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the flickering light of the chamber. Jonathan froze, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the face. It was him. Another duplicate, another Jonathan, stood before him, watching him with an unreadable expression. But this one was different. There was no coldness in his eyes, no hostility. Instead, there was something else, something familiar, a glimmer of recognition, of shared purpose. "Are you the original?" Jonathan whispered, his voice trembling. The duplicate didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, placing a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. His touch was warm, solid, real. "No," the duplicate finally said, his voice soft. "But that doesn't matter, does it?" Jonathan stared at him, his mind racing. And in that moment he understood. Whether he was the original or just another fragment, it didn't change what he had to do. Together, they turned back to the glowing fragments, their souls intertwined in a way that defied explanation. And as they raised the crowbar one last time, Jonathan knew that the truth of his identity no longer mattered. What mattered was ending the tree's reign and setting them all free. The heart of Spec 038 pulsed before Jonathan, dark and ominous, like a living wound festering in the center of the chamber. The light from the shattered soul fragments flickered around him, casting jagged shadows that seemed to twist and warp the very air. He could feel the weight of the tree's presence pressing down on him, its hunger palpable, a dark force that radiated malevolence. But this was different from before. This was no longer just a mindless entity feeding on fragments of souls. It was aware of him now. Jonathan stood frozen, his chest tight as he gazed at the pulsing core. It was like nothing he had ever seen, twisted tendrils of black and crimson, shifting and writhing as though alive, as though the tree itself was some terrible, sentient being. And within it, deep in its dark center, he could see something moving, a vague, swirling shape, like a black hole devouring everything in its path. And then the voice came. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but growing louder with every word until it echoed in his mind, crawling into his thoughts like a serpent. "Jonathan." He staggered back, his breath catching in his throat as the voice enveloped him. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, something vast and ancient, something that spoke not with words but with need. "You have come so far, haven't you?" The voice purred, low and hypnotic. "But you're lost, aren't you? You don't even know if you are real." Jonathan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand firm despite the suffocating weight of the voice. "I came to stop you," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "I came to end this." The tree's core pulsed violently, the dark tendrils shuddering as though amused. The voice came again, deeper, darker. "End this? No, Jonathan, you've come to find yourself, and now you have a choice." The words sent a chill through him. He could feel the tree reaching into him, probing the depths of his soul, searching for his deepest fears and doubts. And in that moment he realized it knew everything. It knew what he feared most, and it was going to use that against him. "You want to be free, don't you?" the voice whispered. "You want to know if you are real. I can give you that, Jonathan. I can return your soul to you. You'll be whole again. When you can leave this place, live as you were meant to. All you have to do is let me feed." Jonathan's heart raced as the offer hung in the air. He could feel the truth of it, the pull of his fragmented soul, still trapped somewhere within the tree, still incomplete. If he let the tree continue, if he allowed it to keep duplicating and consuming, it would free him. He could be whole again. But at what cost? His gaze swept across the chamber, taking in the flickering fragments of other souls, the faces of those who had been consumed by the tree, trapped here, their lives stolen and fragmented. If he accepted the tree's offer, he would be free, but they would remain imprisoned, feeding the tree's insatiable hunger. And worse, the tree would continue to grow, to spread its dark influence, warping reality and consuming more souls. It wasn't just about him anymore. Jonathan clenched his fists tighter, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The tree's voice was intoxicating, seductive in its promise of freedom. He could feel it calling to him, offering him what he had wanted for so long, an escape from the madness, a return to himself. But if he took it, if he let the tree continue, he would be condemning countless others to the same fate. He would be feeding the very thing he had come to destroy. "What will it be, Jonathan?" The tree whispered, its voice dripping with dark temptation. "Your freedom, or their salvation." Jonathan's mind raced. The choice was impossible. He had fought so hard to survive, to find out who he truly was, and now that he was faced with the truth, it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. But deep down, he knew the answer. He had known it all along, even as the tree tried to twist his thoughts, to cloud his judgment. With a deep breath, he raised his head, his eyes locked on the pulsing core of the tree. "I won't let you continue," Jonathan said, his voice steady, resolute. "I won't let you consume anyone else. I won't let you feed on me." The tree's core pulsed violently, its tendrils thrashing as the voice shifted from soft whispers to a thunderous roar, filled with anger and fury. "You fool," it snarled. "You could have been free. You could have been whole. And now you will die here like all the rest." Jonathan felt the air around him grow colder, the tendrils of the tree reaching for him, wrapping around his body with terrifying strength. But he didn't waver. He could feel the weight of the souls trapped within the tree, their suffering, their torment, and he knew that he couldn't let it continue. He couldn't let the tree win. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jonathan raised the crowbar, his muscles burning with exhaustion. The tree roared, its voice filled with rage, but Jonathan didn't stop. He swung the crowbar down, striking the pulsing core of the tree with all his might. The moment the crowbar connected, the chamber shuddered. The roots and tendrils writhed violently, the light from the soul fragments flaring brighter than ever before. The tree screamed in his mind, a deafening, agonized wail that reverberated through his very soul. But Jonathan didn't stop. He swung again, harder this time, and the core began to crack. The tree's grip on him loosened, the tendrils falling away as the light within the chamber grew blinding. The core split open, and with one final, desperate strike, Jonathan shattered it completely. The sound of the tree's scream echoed through the chamber, and then in an instant, the light exploded outward. The walls of the chamber collapsed in on themselves, the roots withering and decaying as the souls trapped within were finally set free. Jonathan fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the tree's presence faded from his mind. The air around him grew still, the oppressive weight of the tree's hunger lifting at last. But as the light dimmed, and the souls of those trapped within faded into the ether, Jonathan knew that something had been lost. He wasn't the original. And now he never would be. The tree was gone, its power destroyed. But Jonathan remained a fragmented soul, a man caught between the cracks of reality, unsure of who he truly was. But in the end, it didn't matter. He had done what was right. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt whole. The room was filled with an eerie, oppressive silence as Jonathan stood before the remains of SCP-038. The shattered heart of the tree had dimmed, its once dark tendrils withering and curling in on themselves like dying serpents. But something in the air still felt wrong, unfinished. He could sense it, a lingering malevolence, a presence that refused to be fully extinguished. The tree wasn't completely gone. Not yet. Jonathan had tried everything to stop it, had shattered its heart, released the souls it had consumed, but something deep within the core still pulled at him. It whispered to him in the darkness, a promise of finality, of an end that only he could bring. One last thing. His breath was shaky, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped closer to SCP-038. The tree's once mighty roots were now thin and brittle, but deep in its core, the ability to duplicate, its most dangerous gift, still pulsed with a quiet, malevolent life. Jonathan knew what it wanted from him. He knew what he had to do, though every fiber of his being recoiled at the thought. To destroy it for good, he would have to duplicate himself. It was a risk he had sworn he wouldn't take, but now, in the final moments of this battle, there was no other choice. His mind swirled with doubt, with fear. What would happen if he created a perfect clone? What if he split himself, his soul, his memories, his very identity? Could he survive that? Could he win? But there was no time left for hesitation. Jonathan placed his hand against the bark of SCP-038, the tree's surface still warm, still alive. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, he felt a familiar pull, a tug deep in his chest as the tree responded to his touch. The air around him grew thick, heavy with the tree's dying energy, and the ground beneath him trembled as it began to work. He stepped back, watching in silent dread as something began to emerge from the bark. The clone formed quickly, its body growing out of the tree like a twisted reflection, like a mirror image of Jonathan himself. Its features were identical, down to the smallest scar on his hand, the weariness in his eyes. It was him, every detail replicated with perfect precision. But as the clone opened its eyes, Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't like the other duplicates. This one was different. It was him. The clone stood before him, its expression unreadable, its eyes cold and calculating. And then, slowly, it smiled, a twisted, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine. "You knew this would happen," the clone said softly, its voice eerily calm. "You knew the moment you touched the tree that you'd never come out of this hole." Jonathan took a step back, his pulse quickening. The voice, the way it spoke, it wasn't just mimicking him. It was speaking as though it were already him. "I won't let you take control," Jonathan said, his voice firmer than he felt. The clone laughed softly, a sound that echoed unnervingly in the hollow chamber. "Take control? We're the same, Jonathan. We always have been. But now there's two of us, and there's only room for one." Jonathan felt a sharp pang in his chest as the weight of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a fight against another version of himself. This was a battle for his identity, a battle to determine who would be the real Jonathan Reed. The clone moved first, its speed terrifyingly fast. Jonathan barely had time to raise his arms in defense as the clone lunged at him, its hands swinging with brutal force. They collided, their bodies crashing together as they struggled for dominance. Jonathan's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, but he fought back with everything he had, knowing that this wasn't just a physical fight, it was a fight for his soul. Each blow felt like he was hitting himself. Each movement mirrored perfectly. Every thought, every reflex, every emotion, it was as if they were the same person, moving in sync, knowing each other's weaknesses, each other's strengths. Jonathan slammed the clone against the wall, but the clone was relentless. It twisted out of his grasp, delivering a sharp punch to his gut that left him gasping for air. They were locked in a deadly dance, neither gaining ground, neither yielding. "I am you," the clone hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "I have your memories, your thoughts. I know your fears. You're just as much a fragment as I am." Jonathan's mind raced. The clone's words echoed in his thoughts, worming their way into his psyche. Was it right? Was he just another fragment, another copy? He had seen his soul trapped in the tree, had felt the weight of the truth. But now, facing this perfect replica, he didn't know what to believe anymore. "Maybe you're right," Jonathan spat, dodging another attack. "But I'm the one who made the choice to stop this." The clone's eyes flickered with something dark, something Jonathan recognized all too well. "Are you it sneered? Or did the tree make it for you?" The question hung in the air, but Jonathan couldn't let it paralyze him. The clone was faster, stronger, every bit the equal of Jonathan himself, but he knew that if he hesitated, if he allowed doubt to cloud his mind, he would lose. He would become the very thing he was trying to destroy. With a roar of fury, Jonathan lunged at the clone, tackling it to the ground. They rolled across the floor, the impact sending sharp pain through his body. The clone's hands were around his throat now, squeezing with terrifying strength. But Jonathan fought back, grabbing the crowbar that had been knocked aside during their struggle. He swung it with everything he had, the metal connecting with the clone's head with a sickening crack. The clone fell back, dazed but not defeated. Blood trickled down its face, mirroring the pain Jonathan himself felt, but it didn't stop. It snarled, lunging at him once more. Jonathan's vision blurred, the edges of his consciousness flickering as though he were fighting himself on a level far deeper than just flesh and bone. He could feel his memories slipping, his thoughts unraveling, splitting between them. They were both fighting for the same soul. With one final burst of strength, Jonathan raised the crowbar and brought it down on the clone's chest, the impact shuddering through his own body as though he were hitting himself. The clone gasped, its eyes wide with shock, with pain, with something else, recognition. For a moment they both froze, their gazes locked. "Which?" one of us, the clone whispered, its voice breaking. Jonathan's heart thundered in his chest. He didn't know. He couldn't tell. They were the same. But in the end, he knew one thing: he couldn't let the tree win. With a final, determined swing, Jonathan struck again, the blow landing with a sickening finality. The clone fell still, its eyes wide and unseeing, the life draining from its body. But as it lay there, something strange happened. Its features began to blur, its form twisting and warping, until it was no longer recognizable as Jonathan at all. It became a shadow, a fading echo of what it had once been. Jonathan collapsed beside it, gasping for breath, his body aching, his mind spinning. He had won. But as the last traces of the clone disappeared, leaving only emptiness behind, Jonathan wasn't sure if he had defeated the tree, or if he had lost himself in the process. Jonathan stood over the fading remnants of the clone, his chest heaving as the silence of the chamber pressed in around him. The battle was over, but the victory tasted hollow. The clone's final words echoed in his mind: "Which one of us?" He looked down at his hands, his body trembling from the exertion and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Was he the real Jonathan, or had the tree left him a fractured echo of the original? The answer eluded him, slipping through his thoughts like water through his fingers. But one thing was certain: the tree had to be destroyed. Jonathan forced himself to stand, his limbs heavy with exhaustion and doubt. The air in the chamber had grown colder, the once living walls of the tree now wilting, decaying as if reacting to the death of the final clone. But its core still pulsed weakly, a faint, dying light that flickered in the dimness. He could feel the tree's power waning, but its connection to the trapped souls, the essence of everything it had consumed, still lingered. And that connection was what kept the tree alive. Jonathan moved slowly, his footsteps echoing through the hollow chamber. The soul fragments embedded in the tree's roots still glowed faintly, their light dim but persistent. Each one represented a life the tree had taken, a soul torn apart by its dark hunger. And each one was still trapped here, bound to the tree's will. He knew that destroying the tree wouldn't just end its power. It would release the souls it had consumed. It would set them free. But there was a price to pay. The damage that had been done, the warping of reality, the corruption spreading through Site-23, was irreversible. Even if he succeeded in severing the tree's connection, the scars it had left on the fabric of existence would remain. Jonathan reached the base of the tree's core, the place where the roots twisted and coiled like serpents. The pulsing light within the core flickered weakly, a shadow of its former power, but still alive, still hungry. He could feel the weight of the souls trapped within, their desperate cries filling the air around him, pleading for release. He placed his hand against the bark once more, feeling the faint warmth that remained. The tree was dying, but it hadn't given up yet. It still clung to the souls it had taken, refusing to let go, feeding on the last remnants of their energy. Jonathan's heart tightened in his chest, the weight of what he was about to do settling over him. He knew there was no turning back. "I don't care if I'm the real one," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness. "I'll do what I have to." The tree stirred beneath his hand, its tendrils shifting weakly, as if sensing what he intended. But it was too late. Jonathan had made his choice. With a sharp intake of breath, he raised the crowbar one last time and brought it down with all his strength, striking the heart of the tree's core. The impact reverberated through the chamber, the sound of metal against wood echoing like a death knell. The light within the core flickered violently, then dimmed. Jonathan struck again and again, each blow tearing at the tree's connection to the souls it had trapped. The ground beneath him trembled as the tree began to wither, its once living bark cracking and crumbling to dust. The tendrils that had wrapped around the souls began to decay, their grip loosening as the tree's power faded. And then, with a final, shuddering breath, the core of SCP-038 collapsed. A wave of energy surged through the chamber, and Jonathan stumbled back as the light from the soul fragments burst outward, flooding the room with a brilliant, blinding glow. The souls, those who had been trapped for so long, were finally released. He could feel their presence fading, dissipating into the ether, free at last from the tree's dark grasp. But as the light dimmed and the chamber fell into silence once more, Jonathan knew the victory had come at a terrible cost. The damage to reality was irreversible. The walls of the chamber shifted, warping and distorting as the fabric of existence continued to unravel. Objects flickered in and out of existence, the boundaries between space and time cracking like shattered glass. The tree's destruction had severed its connection to the souls, but the damage it had done, the damage to reality itself, could not be undone. Jonathan's breath came in shallow gasps as he looked around at the broken, decaying remains of the tree. The clones, the duplications, they were losing power. He could feel the pull of the tree's influence fading, the clones he had encountered flickering out of existence one by one, their hold on the world weakening. But the scars they had left behind remained, and the breaches in reality continued to spread. He sank to his knees, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The souls were free. The tree was dying, but the world around him would never be the same. And then came the final question, the one that had been gnawing at him since the beginning. Who am I? Jonathan stared at the withering remains of the tree, his mind racing with fragments of memories, pieces of himself that didn't quite fit. He couldn't shake the feeling that part of him was still missing, that he was just a fractured version of something greater, something he would never fully understand. But did it even matter anymore? The tree was gone. Its grip on reality was broken. And now there was only the aftermath to face. As Jonathan stood amidst the crumbling remains of SCP-038, he realized that the question of whether he was the original or the clone had lost its meaning. He had made his choice. He had fought for what he believed was right, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The world around him might be broken, reality might be unraveling, but he had done what he could. And now he would live with the consequences. The weight of the past, of his identity, still hung over him, but as the light from the fading souls dimmed, Jonathan felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever he was, whoever he was still here. And that would have to be enough. The sterile hallways of Site-23 were eerily quiet in the aftermath of the breach. Where once the air had been thick with the crackling energy of SCP 038's influence, warping reality, twisting the space around them, there was now only an oppressive silence. The tree was gone, its connection severed, but the remnants of its dark influence lingered in every corner of the facility. The Foundation had moved quickly to contain the damage, as they always did. Teams of researchers and security personnel flooded the site, cleaning up the wreckage, cataloging the anomalies, and assessing the extent of the breach. The aftermath was a mess of broken containment units, fractured realities, and the faint echoes of a disaster barely averted. And at the center of it all was Jonathan. He stood in the observation chamber overlooking what had once been SCP 038's containment area. And the tree was nothing more than ash and withered roots now, its once mighty presence reduced to dust. The walls of the chamber were cracked, the ceiling sagging under the strain of the breach, but the worst of it was over. The reality warping clones had vanished, their power fading along with the tree's last breath. The Foundation was hailing him as a hero. Word had already spread about how he had fought to destroy the tree, how he had faced his own duplicates, and made the ultimate sacrifice to stop the breach from spiraling out of control. He had saved them all, they said. He had saved reality itself. Jonathan couldn't feel anything but emptiness. The question that had haunted him since the beginning still clung to his thoughts. a dark shadow that refused to let go. Am I the real Jonathan? It had been a blur of confusion, memories split and shared between him and the clone. The final battle, the struggle for control, it had left him uncertain, fragmented. He could still feel the weight of the clone's thoughts, the echoes of its voice in his mind, and as he stood there, staring out at the ruins of the tree, the truth seemed more elusive than ever. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the cool metal of his watch press against his skin. It was his watch, wasn't it? He remembered it, the way it had been a gift from his father, the way he had worn it every day since he started at the Foundation. But now, every memory felt fragile, like it had been placed there, not lived. The door to the observation chamber slid open, and Dr. Klein stepped inside, his expression as stoic as ever. He crossed the room with quiet steps, standing beside Jonathan as they both looked out over the ruined containment area. "You did well," Jonathan Klein said, his voice measured. "The breach could have been much worse. You stopped it." Jonathan didn't respond at first, his eyes still fixed on the crumbling remains of the tree. "Did I?" he asked finally, his voice low, uncertain. Klein glanced at him, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "You did. The clones, the reality warping, none of it could have been contained without you." Jonathan nodded absently, though his mind wasn't on the breach. It was on himself. He turned to Klein, his gaze hard, searching. "How do you know I'm the real Jonathan?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a weight. Klein was silent for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly as if he had expected the question. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before answering. "We don't," he admitted quietly. "But we also don't have any reason to believe you aren't." Jonathan stared at him, his chest tightening. "That's not good enough." Klein's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, Jonathan saw something more than just the clinical detachment that the Foundation so often required. There was empathy there, a quiet understanding. "Jonathan," Klein said, his voice low, "it doesn't matter if you're the original or not. What matters is that you made the choice to stop the breach. You made the choice to save us all. That's who you are." Jonathan looked away, the weight of Klein's words settling over him. Maybe that was the truth. Maybe it didn't matter. But the doubt gnawed at him, burrowed deep into his mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. As Klein turned to leave, Jonathan found himself alone again, surrounded by the silent ruins of the containment area. The Foundation's teams were still working, still cataloging the damage, but to Jonathan, it felt as though the world had stopped moving. Time itself seemed fractured, broken in the wake of the breach. He stepped closer to the observation window, his fingers lightly brushing the glass as he stared at the remnants of SCP-38. The tree's downfall had left a void, not just in the facility, but in him. The souls it had consumed were free now, but the damage both to reality and to Jonathan was irreversible. As the days passed, the Foundation would rebuild. They always did. The anomalies that had escaped would be recontained, the breaches patched up, the memories of the chaos carefully erased from the world's awareness. But Jonathan knew that nothing would ever feel whole again, not for him. His memories were fragmented, pieces of a life that may or may not have been his own. The soul that had once been Jonathan Reed was fractured, and now, whether he was the original or just a perfect copy, he wasn't sure he could ever know the difference. He could hear the distant hum of the Foundation's machinery, the quiet murmurs of voices echoing down the halls as the cleanup continued. But in the back of his mind, the question still lingered, haunting him. Which one of us? He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to push the thought away. But it was always there, always whispering in the corners of his mind. The breach was over. The tree was dead. But in its place, it had left something behind. Doubt. Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the coffee cup in front of him. The cup had been sitting there for hours, untouched, or at least that's what he thought. But now, as he looked closer, it wasn't exactly where he had left it. The cup had shifted just a fraction, maybe an inch to the right. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. He blinked, trying to clear his mind, but when he looked again, the cup was exactly where it should be. He let out a shaky breath, running his hands over his face. Was it his imagination, or was something truly wrong? Since the breach, since SCP-038's destruction, Jonathan had tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the world around him didn't feel right anymore. Every day was filled with tiny, unsettling details. Objects shifting slightly when he wasn't looking. People acting strangely around him. Their gazes lingering a little too long, as though they were unsure of who he was. It was like the whole world was off by a few degrees, and Jonathan was the only one who noticed. He pushed the cup away, standing abruptly and pacing around his quarters. His reflection in the mirror caught his eye, and he froze, staring at himself. His face was pale, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, but it was still his face. Or at least, it looked like him. But the longer he stared, the more uncertain he became. There was something about his expression that felt unfamiliar, something distant, as though he were looking at a stranger wearing his skin. He shook his head, tearing his gaze away from the mirror. This was madness. He needed to focus, to ground himself in reality. But what was reality now? Since the breach, everything had become blurred, fractured. Jonathan reached for the desk, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of a report he had been working on. But as soon as he touched it, a wave of confusion washed over him. He didn't remember writing it. The words on the page were in his handwriting, the details meticulously documented, but none of it felt familiar. It was as if someone else had been in his mind, guiding his hand, creating memories that didn't belong to him. A knock on the door broke through the fog in his mind. Jonathan tensed, his pulse quickening as he turned toward the door. When he opened it, Dr. Klein stood on the other side, his expression unreadable as usual. "Jonathan," Klein said, his tone cautious. "I wanted to check in. How are you feeling?" Jonathan forced a smile, but it felt wrong on his face, like a mask he didn't recognize. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice sounded hollow to his own ears. Klein's gaze lingered on him, sharp and analytical. It made Jonathan's skin crawl. "Are you sure?" Klein asked, stepping into the room. "There have been reports. Some of the staff are concerned about you." Jonathan's stomach twisted. "Concerned?" Klein nodded slowly. "They've noticed things, small things. You've been acting differently. People have seen objects moving when you're around, memories that don't align with reality. But you," he hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Certain that you're okay?" Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a flicker of panic rise, but he swallowed it down, his mind racing. Had they noticed too? Was he the only one who felt that reality was slipping, that things were shifting around him in subtle, unnerving ways? "I'm fine," Jonathan repeated, more firmly this time. "It's just, everything has been strange since the breach. I'm still adjusting." Klein studied him for a long moment, and Jonathan could see the doubt in his eyes. He wanted to scream, to demand answers. Did Klein know? Could he sense that something was wrong with him, that he might not be who he thought he was? After a tense silence, Klein sighed and nodded. "Take care of yourself, Jonathan. We've been through a lot." He gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes, before turning and leaving the room. The door clicked shut, and Jonathan was left alone with the silence again. But now the air felt heavier, as though the very room was pressing down on him, watching him. He sank into a chair, his mind swirling with doubt and confusion. What if I'm not the real Jonathan? The question gnawed at him, whispering in the back of his mind. The battle with the clone had been chaotic, violent. His memories were fractured, pieces of them missing, others that felt like they didn't belong. And now, with every passing day, those missing pieces seemed to fill themselves in, but not with his own experiences. Someone else's memories were slipping into the cracks, memories that felt foreign, disconnected. His fingers drummed against the desk, and without thinking, he reached into his drawer, pulling out an old notebook he had used to keep notes. As he flipped through the pages, his breath caught in his throat. The writing was different. It was still his handwriting, but a tone, the details, they felt alien, as though someone else had been writing in his place. He skimmed through the pages, his heart racing. Some of the entries mentioned events he couldn't remember, interactions with people he didn't recall meeting. And yet, the writing was undeniably his. His eyes landed on one entry, and a chill ran down his spine. "I've been having dreams about the tree. I see it when I close my eyes, even when I'm awake. I think it's still inside me." Jonathan's breath hitched. He didn't remember writing that. He didn't remember having dreams about the tree. But as he sat there, staring at the words. An image flashed in his mind. Dark, twisted branches, pulsing with life. The tree was still there, lurking somewhere deep inside him, its presence subtle but undeniable. The clone soul wasn't destroyed. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had thought the battle with the clone had ended with its death. But what if it hadn't? What if the tree had left a piece of the clone inside him? A fragment of its soul that was still alive. Shifting objects, foreign memories. It all made sense now. The clone had never truly died. It was still there, buried deep within him, waiting to resurface. Jonathan's hands shook as he slammed the notebook shut. He felt a surge of panic, his pulse racing as the walls around him seemed to close in. He wasn't just haunted by the question of whether he was the real Jonathan, he was haunted by the thought that he was both. Both the original and the clone, their souls tangled together in a twisted reflection of each other. And he stood pacing the room, his thoughts spinning out of control. How could he live like this? How could he trust himself, trust his own memories, when he didn't know which ones were real? The walls seemed to shift as he moved, the air growing colder, and for a brief moment he could almost see the clone's face in the shadows, smiling at him, whispering that they were one and the same. Jonathan stopped, gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. The tree was gone, but its legacy remained. Reality was fractured, and he was fractured along with it. And now, he wasn't sure if he could ever put the pieces back together. Jonathan stood once again before the ruins of SCP-038, the faint, decaying remnants of the everything tree casting long shadows in the dim light of the containment chamber. The Foundation had cordoned off the area, labeling the tree's remnants as a relic of its former anomaly, but to Jonathan it still held power. The tree's presence was weak, barely a flicker of what it had once been, but it was enough. The question, the one that had haunted him since the breach, since his battle with the clone, had never left his mind: am I the real Jonathan? He had tried to push it away, to bury it under layers of routine, but it gnawed at him, whispering in his thoughts, shifting reality around him. The strange occurrences, the fragmented memories, the way the world felt just a little off, it all pointed back to this moment, to this place. The containment chamber was cold, a chill that seeped into his bones. The smell of decay lingered in the air, and though the tree was no longer alive in the way it once was, its influence still pulsed faintly beneath the surface. Jonathan approached the withered remains cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He stopped just before the twisted, brittle bark, staring down at the darkened roots, now lifeless and curled in on themselves. Yet, even in its death, the tree called to him. What if I touched it again? The thought was a dangerous one, but Jonathan couldn't shake it. The tree had the power to duplicate, to replicate any object that touched its bark. It had created a perfect copy of him once before, a clone that had fought him, that had nearly taken his place. But if he duplicated himself again, if he let the tree create another version of him, would it finally give him the answer he sought? Would it reveal who the real Jonathan Reed was? His hands trembled as he reached out, his fingertips hovering just above the bark. The faint warmth of the tree pulsed beneath his skin, a distant echo of the power it once held. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts spiraling as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. What if I'm the clone? The thought chilled him. If he duplicated himself again, would he create another copy, just as uncertain as he was? Or would it reveal the truth, strip away the layers of confusion and doubt, and show him who he really was? His breath hitched, his pulse quickening as the bark seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, urging him forward. The memories of the clone, the battle, the fractured sense of self all blurred together, swirling in his mind like a storm. He didn't know if he could trust his own thoughts anymore. He didn't know if the memories that filled his head were his, or if they had been stolen, taken by the tree in some dark exchange he hadn't been aware of. But he couldn't keep living like this. The uncertainty was suffocating, a slow erosion of his identity. He needed to know. Jonathan swallowed hard, his fingers brushing lightly against the bark. The sensation was immediate, familiar. The tree's power, though weakened, still flowed beneath the surface, waiting, ready to create. He could feel the pull of it, the way it reached into him, searching for something to duplicate, something to replicate. One touch. That's all it would take. One touch and the tree would create another version of him, another Jonathan Reed. And maybe, just maybe, it would reveal the truth. Maybe he would be able to see the clone, to know which of them was real and which was just a hollow reflection. But as his fingers hovered just above the bark, another thought pierced his mind, sharp and clear. What if it doesn't matter? What if the distinction between the original and the clone had ceased to exist the moment the tree had first touched him? What if, in some twisted way, they were both real, both fragments of the same person, split and mirrored through the tree's dark power? Could either version of him claim to be more real than the other? Jonathan's hand trembled, inches from the bark, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He wanted to pull away, to walk out of the containment chamber and leave the question unanswered. But he couldn't. The tree still held too much power over him. The need to know, the need to understand, was too strong. His hand inched closer, the warmth of the bark almost tangible now. The faint hum of the tree's dying energy thrummed through his fingertips, and he knew that once he touched it, there would be no turning back. Would duplicating himself again solve anything? Or would it only deepen the mystery, creating another layer of confusion, another fragment of his identity? The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in, as if the tree's presence was growing stronger, darker. Jonathan's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he wrestled with the choice before him. And then, in a moment of quiet resolve, he made his decision. His fingers touched the bark. The warmth surged through him, the power of the tree wrapping around his hand, pulling at his very essence. He felt the familiar sensation of something being drawn from him, something duplicating. But before he could see what emerged, before he could look into the eyes of the being the tree had created, the room seemed to flicker, the edges of reality warping. The story ended. And the question, whether Jonathan was the original or another soulless copy, remained unanswered.